for those of you who don't know me. I am president of Teeter Group here in Altoona, and I really just want to thank you guys. We know it's a big commitment to take a whole morning out of your busy schedules to make time to be here today, so we do want to thank you for putting us on your agenda. I also want to thank Barb Smith and Jackie Dietze in our office. They've done a heck of a job putting together the program this morning. I think, Barb, how many years have we been talking about doing a seminar like this? 2.5. About 2.5, 3 years, and it finally got put together. So we are thrilled to have their expertise in putting together the speakers. We think this morning is going to be a real dynamic morning with a wealth of information that is hopefully super applicable to all of you in the room. Just a little bit about us, and this is not by any means meant to be a commercial for us, but I did want to just say, who we are. We are fortunate to already work with so many of you in the room. Delighted to have you as customers, but there's a lot of folks in here that we don't work with now, so I will share with you just a little bit about us. We are an independent insurance agency. We have offices in Altoona and Martinsburg, and we're part of a group of agents called Keystone Insurers Group. Essentially, Keystone is a network of independent agents across the country. Keystone is, and just was recently reaffirmed, recognized as the third largest independent agency partnership in the country. So we're quite proud of that. While being still independently owned and operated, we have the privilege of being part of a large organization that gives us access to preferred programs, preferred pricing, preferred advantages, some of which are for specific industries, and one of which happens to be municipalities, municipal authorities, fire departments, emergency service providers. So we're delighted to have that relationship. We are independent, and we work with a lot of insurance companies. So the EMCs, AmTrust, Selective, Liberty, Travelers, VFIS, we really have access to all those markets, as well as Swift and some others. But we are a little bit unique, and I just will share with you the fact that it was about 15 years ago when my husband and I made a very clear and distinct decision to try to differentiate our agency from others in the area. We wanted to be different. And most of you probably realize insurance agents, there's a lot of us out there, and a lot of folks simply view their job as placing insurance for their customers. And that, while is one very critical part of what we do as an insurance agency, we wanted to provide a little bit more value-added service, and the whole goal was really to help our clients create a better story. And by creating a better story, our clients, we like to think, will achieve the best long-term financial results, both from claims prevention, claims management, safety initiatives, loss control initiatives, that will help you all budget and plan accordingly for the financial risks that you face. And so 15 years ago, we said, this is what we want to do, and we have since then been allocating a lot of time, energy, resources to developing and continuing to grow and evolve our services to provide that type of result. So that's just a little bit about us. The partners that are here with us today, I do want to recognize Brad's here with the law firm of, I'm probably going to butcher this because I've butchered it every time I've said it today, Rulis and Bochicchio. Bochicchio. All right, it's close. They're a law firm out of Pittsburgh, offices in Pittsburgh and Philadelphia, and they have agreed to co-sponsor the event for us today. They have been a tremendous resource for us in guiding our clients through some very challenging cases, specifically as it relates to workers' comp and to heart and lung issues. They are widely regarded and known for their work in the city of Pittsburgh, Allegheny County. And I don't want to discount or discredit any of the local solicitors, but they've just been a real partner for us, and so I do want to recognize them as a co-sponsor for us today. The why are we here piece is we, as an agency, like I said, want to do more for our clients, but we also want to be a resource. I am a secretary of a municipal authority myself. I have been for over 10 years, and certainly understand what it's like to work with limited budgets, limited staff, or zero staff in my case, volunteers, and managing expenses and those kind of things. And so we get what you have to deal with, and wanted to provide some tools and techniques and best practices that might help you also be able to manage things for your municipality. It's also a really good way to give back and to say thank you. Like I said, many of you in the room are already customers of ours, and we do appreciate your long-term continued support. This is another way we can give a little something back to you, breakfast and hopefully some more nuggets of information you can use. Speaker-wise, I want to briefly just kind of let you know who is in the room. You've got the agenda in front of you, but I want to just kind of run down so everybody knows who we've got available as experts, because we have a long tenured list of experience in the room. First off, our state representative, Mr. Lou Schmitt, up here at front. Kind of hard to miss him, pretty commanding presence when he walked in the room. For those of you who don't already know him, he is obviously our state representative for the 79th District. He has spent over 30 years as a highly respected civil trial lawyer, well-regarded arbitrator and mediator, and we've asked him to very specifically highlight some of the legislative issues going on today that could impact you both from an insurance standpoint, workers' comp, and so we thought that would be relevant for us today. And we know a lot of you maybe don't get out to or didn't get up to the PSAB conference or the PSATS convention down in April where they do those legislative updates. For those of you who've already heard some of that, I'm sorry, some of it might be a little bit of a repeat. But for some of us with limited budgets, we weren't able to go to some of those things, and so we thought we would bring him to you. We've got Barb Hoover-Smith then, and Robert Franchetti. Together, they're going to give the meat of the whole workers' comp best practices. Barb Smith, she is just a real gem. We're happy to have her on board. She comes to us with over 30-plus years experience in the industry, was a workers' comp claims adjuster, managed an entire claims organization at the insurance carrier level. She also then spent another decade working for a self-insured health carrier system, healthcare system, with I think what 15,000 employees, where she oversaw the administration of workers' comp and other insurances for that organization. And now she's working with us and bringing that level of experience and expertise to help our clients in all facets of the risk management, claims prevention department. Robert comes to us with 40-plus years of experience, and he is now the workers' comp claims supervisor for Employers Mutual Casualty, one of the partner insurance companies that we work with through Keystone. He's going to be working with Barb in their presentation. And then we'll have Brad, who is from Rulis and Bochicchio. Got it? He's going to be sharing a very in-depth presentation on workers' comp issues, but and it relates to heart and lung. And he is really widely regarded as a extensive knowledge and expertise in the field of workers' compensation, heart and lung. He represents interests of employers, insurance companies, as well as third-party administrators in all phases of litigation. So we're just delighted to have him on board. And then last but not least will be Mr. Doug Hoyle. He is the Senior Loss Control Representative from AmTrust Insurance Company. AmTrust is a workers' comp specialty carrier that we work with, writes other lines, but we work with them primarily for workers' comp. He's a local grad at IUP, Safety Sciences graduate with, are you in the 30-plus, 25-plus? 30-plus years of experience in the industry, and comes to us from the Harrisburg area. He is a certified safety professional and OSHA outreach trainer for construction and general industry, and he's going to be sharing some best practices tips on things that he's finding out in the municipal sector for clients that he's going out to visit. He does those actual field visits, so we are delighted. He's a little under the weather today, but he's a real trooper. Maybe don't shake his hand. Bronchitis and pneumonia, but we're delighted to have you. Sorry, you're the last guy on the agenda. But that's what we're looking at in terms of experience and expertise, so I hope it's going to be meaningful. The last little nugget I'm just going to share with you briefly is, and Barb just asked me to touch base on this insurance market. You know, back when I started couple of years ago, the market for municipalities insurance was just getting a little bit more available. So some of you, if you've been around a long time, the 30 years ago, I mean, there was a time when it was very difficult. There were limited options for municipalities, both on the comp side and the property casualty lines. Carriers were splitting who would take which piece. Now it's been pretty competitive. There are a lot of options out there. Like I mentioned, EMC, Selective, AmTrust, Argonaut, Cincinnati Travelers, all of those. But as many of you know, the workers' comp industry changed pretty significantly for our municipalities, and that had a lot to do with that Act 46, which I believe Lou may touch on too. But that Act 46, you all know, the cancer provision, volunteer firefighters. We love our firefighters. We want to take care of them, but that whole change really impacted the insurance marketplace and quite honestly shriveled up the availability of comp for our firemen. Fortunately, AmTrust was a real leader and took the whatever by the horns and said, you know, we're going to stay in this market. We love our municipalities. We're going to continue to, on a case-by-case basis, right, most of our municipalities that still have volunteer fire exposure, but most of the other carriers left the marketplace. So that is still something that we are keeping a pulse on. Perhaps Lou will have some input into maybe how that's going to change moving forward, or we can tell him we'd like to see that change moving forward to make things better and more available for all of us. We are finding, however, that even with that limitation and even with the aggressiveness of insurance companies still being competitive in this space, the clients who are getting the preferred pricing, the preferred dividends, the preferred treatment are those that have really changed their story. And when we can tell a better story about a client who's 100% embraced safety initiatives, policy development, loss control development, trying to minimize risk, they ultimately get the best representation out in the marketplace. So that kind of brings us back to why we're here today. Let's help all of us do a better job to be safer, smarter, more cost effective, all of that stuff. And I will now let the speakers go ahead and run the show, since they're the ones that we want to hear from, not me. So first up this morning is going to be Representative Lee Schmitt.
Good morning, everybody. Good morning. I bring you greetings from the General Assembly this morning. And as April had said earlier, before I became a state representative, I spent 31 years as an insurance defense lawyer, working and doing all different areas of insurance defense. I've done everything from premises liability to medical malpractice defense to municipal liability defense, general liability defense. So anything that you could possibly do as an insurance defense lawyer over 31 years, I did it. So I have quite a bit of experience in that area. The insurance lobbyists in Harrisburg love me, let me just tell you. When I got down there, they came up to me and said, oh, finally, we were always battling against these trial lawyers down here. We finally got a defense lawyer in the state legislature. And so some of the things I want to talk about today are some legislation that's out there, some bills that are currently pending in the General Assembly. And before I do, I'm going to be reading from some co-sponsorship memos. I don't know what you folks might know about what co-sponsorship memos are, but there are a few ways that bills can get introduced into the state legislature, actually get drafted. Sometimes legislators themselves will draft legislation and introduce bills. That doesn't happen very often, and it probably shouldn't. Not because we aren't capable of drafting our own legislation, but because a lot of times there may be a legislation already out there on that subject that's pending. There may be conflicting legislation out there, and so if we go it alone and introduce a bill, a lot of times we'll find out that we probably shouldn't have done what we did. So there are a couple other ways that I think are preferable to introducing and drafting legislation. One way is you can send a request up to what's called the LRB, the Legislative Reference Bureau. And the Legislative Reference Bureau are basically usually lawyers, and their job is basically just to draft legislation. So that's one way you can do it. They'll draft it up for you, they'll wordsmith it for you, and then you can introduce it. Another way that you can do it is you can go to the research staff on the committee that would be handling the bill that you're going to introduce. For instance, if I'm going to introduce a criminal bill, that's going to go to the Judiciary Committee. So I can I can meet with somebody from the research staff for the Judiciary Committee. We can work on it together. They can draft it up. And they'll often give me advice, or any legislator, advice about the bill. For instance, if I went to the Judiciary research staff and said, I want a bill that says people over 6'9" should get the death penalty for any crime they commit, they're going to say to me, Lou, it's probably not a good idea for you in particular, but in general, it's probably not going to work. It's probably unconstitutional. It's not a good idea. Whereas the Legislative Reference Bureau, if I tell them to draft that bill, they'll draft it. They'll send it back to me. They don't give me advice or feedback on whether it's a good idea or whether it's constitutional or whether it conflicts with or complements any other pending legislation or even prior legislation. So especially as a freshman legislator, I tend to go through the committee research staffs because they know the substantive areas better than I do. They know what else might be out there in terms of other bills, either in the past or that are currently pending. So what happens when you get the draft back, whether it comes from LRB or whether it comes from the committee research staff, then usually you send out what's called a co-sponsorship memo. And the co-sponsorship memo is an email that goes out to everybody in the House of Representatives, and it says, I'm thinking about introducing a bill, and this is a summary of what the substance of the bill is. And then people can read that memo, and they can decide whether they would like to co-sponsor. They can jump on as a co-sponsor of the proposed legislation. One of the things that I have learned in my short time in the legislature is that you need to read the underlying bill, because sometimes you read one of these co-sponsorship memos and you co-sponsor a bill, and all of a sudden somebody comes up to you and says, "Are you nuts? Do you know what that bill actually said?" And so you kind of have to sometimes even remove yourself as a co-sponsor when that happens. So you have to be very careful with the co-sponsorship memos. But they also do give some insight into exactly what the nature of the bill is and the purpose of the bill, and sometimes they cite some statistics regarding the basis for introducing the legislation. So I will go through some of those. I'll also tell you exactly where the bills are at procedurally in the House of Representatives and explain a little bit to you about that. Now, I've pulled a number of bills. I've pulled a couple Senate bills and then a number of House bills to go over because I thought that they were particularly relevant. And the first Senate bill that I'm going to go over, and these are in numerical order just because I always feel the need to impose order on everything around me. So I printed them out, put them in numerical order, and that's the way I'll go through them with you. The first bill is Senate Bill 94. And Senate Bill 94 was introduced by Senator Martin, and it amends the Workers' Compensation Act. Let me just read you what the co-sponsorship memo had to say about that. This was actually a bill that had been introduced before, and a lot of times bills get introduced, they don't pass in that particular session, and what will happen is they'll be reintroduced in subsequent sessions. And one of the funny things about the legislature is whenever a legislator dies or retires, a bunch of other legislators will go out and see what bills he introduced in the prior session, and they'll grab them all, put their names on them, and reintroduce them in the current session. So that happens all the time. But bills sometimes get reintroduced for session after session after session before they actually pass. So Senate Bill 94 deals with workers' compensation for emergency volunteers. And this had been previously introduced by Senator Vukovich, Senate Bill 1221, and the co-sponsorship memo said that this would ensure workers' compensation coverage for all active duty volunteer firefighters, fire police, officers or directors of a volunteer fire company, and integral members of a volunteer fire company if injured in the performance of their duties. The legislation apparently came about as a result of the Senate Veterans Affairs and Emergency Preparedness Committee hearing session from the previous session, where it was learned that the workers' insurance company, insurance fund, was denying coverage to these volunteers. So what they did is they went out and amended the bill, and it now deals with officers, directors, rescue and life-saving squad members. And I'll read you some of the new language that's in this bill. And some of one of the things I thought was really interesting when I read this bill was it provides that whenever members of volunteer fire departments or volunteer fire companies, members of volunteer ambulance corps, or rescue and life-saving squad members are injured in the performance of duties on state game lands, the member shall be deemed to be an employee of the Pennsylvania Game Commission, which I thought I guarantee the Game Commission didn't come up with that. I was reading that, I thought, so if you're on an emergency run and you're on state game lands, you're deemed an employee of the state Game Commission. But the term members of volunteer fire departments or volunteer fire companies, when used in this article, shall mean any of the following. Number one, an active volunteer firefighter who responds to emergency calls. Number two, a member of a fire police unit affiliated with a volunteer fire department or volunteer fire company. Number three, an officer or director of a volunteer fire department or volunteer fire company. Number four, a participating member of a volunteer fire department or volunteer fire company who provides necessary operational support to the volunteer fire department or volunteer fire company, but does not respond to emergency calls. So operational support includes maintaining the station and equipment, acting as trustee, organizing fundraisers, providing information technology support, and assisting with recruitment and other administrative tasks if the operational support activity is conducted on a regular basis for the benefit of a volunteer fire department or volunteer fire company as approved at the beginning of each year by the authority, organization, or municipality purchasing workers' compensation insurance for the volunteer fire department or volunteer fire company. Now, thank goodness, the term does not include a social member of volunteer fire department or volunteer fire company. The term members of volunteer ambulance corps, when used in this article, shall mean any of the following. Number one, an active volunteer ambulance corpsman who responds to emergency calls, an officer or director of a volunteer ambulance corps. Number three, a participating member of a volunteer ambulance corps who provides necessary operational support to the volunteer ambulance corps but does not respond to emergency calls, similar to the prior definition. And of course, the term does not include a social member of a volunteer ambulance corps. So that's Senate Bill 94. Now, Senate, where is this at? It was referred to the Labor and Industry Committee in the Senate. And by the way, when bills are introduced, the Speaker of the House, in the House of Representatives, or the President pro tem in the Senate, they decide what committees bills are assigned to be considered. And usually, the bill is sent to the committee that has substantive jurisdiction over the subject matter of the bill. For instance, like I said, a criminal bill is going to go to the Judiciary Committee. But I will tell you this, that politics plays a role. And there are some times that a bill will be introduced, and for one reason or another, the Speaker doesn't want it to go to a particular committee. Maybe the chair of that particular committee wouldn't be receptive to the bill, and the Speaker wants the bill to move, or maybe vice versa. Maybe the chair of the committee would be willing to move a bill through that the Speaker doesn't necessarily want to move through the committee yet. So most of the time it goes to the substantive committee that would have jurisdiction over the nature of the bill. But sometimes the Speaker will decide that for political reasons it's going to be assigned to another committee. Maybe the Speaker and that committee chairman, had a fight at breakfast, so he doesn't get the bill, that day. It goes somewhere else. But that's the way that it usually works. And then the committees obviously bring the bills forward to be considered or not, as the chairman decides, and then it gets reported out onto the floor or not if it gets voted down. Leadership controls the agenda in the House of Representatives. The Speaker, the Majority Leader, they control the agenda. They implement that control through the committee system, and more specifically through the committee chair system. Because if committee chairs don't bring bills forward in committee, obviously they don't move out onto the floor of the House. So this bill, the history of this bill, where it's at right now, it was referred on January 21st or 24th of this year to Labor and Industry, what we call L&I, in the Senate. It was reported as amended on June the 11th, which means they considered it, they voted on it in committee, it was amended, and it was voted out of committee successfully. It was given first consideration. Let me tell you a little bit about that. Every bill that passes through either the Senate or the House has to be considered on 3 days. 3 separate days. Now, they can be 3 consecutive days, usually not. 3 separate days. The first reading is when a bill comes out of committee, it's read for the first time on the floor of the House, nothing really happens. Then it moves forward or not. Sometimes a bill's read on the first reading, you never hear about it again. If it's brought up then on second consideration, the second consideration is when there's debate and there's the ability to amend bills, and each amendment has to be voted up or down on a bill. That's second consideration. Once it gets through second consideration, then again, some get through second consideration, we don't ever see them again. If it's brought up then on third consideration, that's when the entire House of Representatives votes on the bill, and it has to be what's called a constitutional majority in order for a bill to pass out of the House. We have 203 members, the constitutional majority is 102. I tell people all the time, the only thing you need in Pennsylvania if you want a new law is 102, 26, and 1. You need 102 representatives, you need 26 senators, and you need one governor to sign it. The 26 and the 102, that's called the constitutional majority. Doesn't matter how many people are in the chamber that day. If you don't get 102 votes in the House, even if there's 101 people on the floor that day and it passes unanimously 101-0, it won't pass the House because it doesn't meet the constitutional majority. So where this was at, it was referred to L&I, it was reported out of the committee as amended in June. It went to first consideration on June 11th, it went to second consideration on June the 19th, and it was re-referred to appropriations on June the 19th. Something must have come up on second consideration that they wanted to send it to another committee. So it came out of Labor and Industry, was read twice, and then was re-referred to appropriations. And by the way, that means the process starts over again. Appropriations has to now consider it and has to vote on it and report it out onto the floor, and then it has to be read again 3 consecutive, not necessarily consecutive days, but 3 days. Some bills do get through in 3 consecutive days if leadership's really pushing something and they want something to move. It will come out bang, bang, bang. And that usually means there's some kind of a deal with the governor when that happens that fast, because it doesn't usually happen that fast. So that was Senate Bill 94. The next bill is Senate Bill 146, and this deals with online training for firefighters. And this is another Senate bill from Senator Brooks. And the co-sponsorship memo indicates that to address the rapidly declining ranks of volunteer firefighters in Pennsylvania, I will soon be reintroducing legislation. Again, this is legislation that had been introduced in a prior session, designed to make online training more readily available to current and prospective first responders. The previous version of this bill was 1079, which had gone through the Senate Veterans Affairs and Emergency Preparedness Committee. And then that one had been re-referred previously to Senate Appropriations, and it was folded into a larger Title 35 rewrite. And then it goes on to talk a little bit about why this bill is needed. Studies on firefighter recruitment and retention challenges in Pennsylvania, which most recently include the SR 6 Commission report, have consistently shown that volunteers often point to training requirements and fundraising demands as factors that have taken a big toll on their time, money, and ability to respond. In the 1970s, Pennsylvania had more than 300,000 volunteer firefighters. Today, we have less than 40,000. Firefighters, and especially younger tech-savvy firefighters in training, have often requested that a portion of their training be offered online. Can you imagine, this generation of kids now not being able to do something online? So yeah, they want to do it online, so okay, we're going to do something about that. And that's so that they have the opportunity to learn this from the convenience of their own homes, which is what these kids are used to doing. I mean, they're used to doing things with their own computers, with their own technology, in their own place. And then this goes on to say, well, some fire training must clearly be hands-on and in person. Many forms of training can be executed effectively online. And this bill would make online training to be developed under the Office of the State Fire Commissioner voluntary, offered at no personal expense to firefighters, and open to both volunteer and career firefighters. And so that's Senate Bill 146. And as far as where it's at this point, January 31st, it was referred to the Veterans Affairs and Emergency Preparedness Committee in the Senate. It was reported out again as amended. So if somebody in committee offered an amendment, the amendment passed, and it was reported out. By the way, there's 25 members of each committee in the House of Representatives. The majority party, which is the Republicans at present, we get 15 members, and the minority party, the Democrats, get 10. So we see a lot of 15 to 10 votes. Let's just put it that way. I can tell you something, I don't ever want to be in the minority, because I see these guys in the minority, and it's just, the majority controls the agenda, they control the committees, they have the committee majority chairs, and they move things through. And if you're in the minority, there's just not a whole lot you can do about it. There's an old saying that the minority has its say and the majority has its way. All you can do is complain and debate and try and amend things and slow things down. But in the minority, there's really not much you can do, because the majority has such control over the process of the House of Representatives. So anyways, it was reported out as amended in March. First consideration was March the 19th. Second consideration was March the 25th. And then it was re-referred to appropriations, I'm guessing again maybe because of some amendments on second consideration. And then appropriations re-reported it out April the 29th. And then it was amended on third consideration on April the 30th. Now, I don't know what the rules are like in the Senate, but I know in the House we can amend things on third consideration. But in order to do that, we first have to have a vote on suspending the rules of the House, because the rules of the House generally don't allow bills to be amended on third consideration. I don't know if it's the same in the Senate. If it is, then they suspended the rules and amended it on third consideration for some reason. By the way, one of the things about the rules of the House of Representatives are, you have written rules and unwritten rules. Often unwritten rules are much more important than written rules. But one of the actual written rules is that we can suspend the rules anytime we want. So, anytime something comes up and, if a mistake is made or something, we can always just vote to suspend the rules and then pretty much do whatever we want. It's kind of like the law. But so it was passed by the Senate May the 6th, and it was passed unanimously, 48-0. Came over to the House. May the 7th, it was referred to the Veterans Affairs and Emergency Preparedness Committee in the House. It was reported out as amended September 18th. It also, usually, and you'll see this, when they come out of committee, that's usually when they have their first reading in the House. And what happens is there's a clerk who stands at the front of the House of Representatives, and this guy speaks faster than any human being I ever heard in my life. And he'll say, the following bills have been reported out of committee, and then, and he just flies through all these bills that have come out of all these committees. I can't even understand what he's saying. And that's the first reading. This bill, and he yells out the numbers and just goes, and he just flies through everything. And I'll sit there and I'll be like, is that as fast as he can talk? I mean, this guy, it's unbelievable. And that's why he has that job, honestly. I said to the speaker one time, I said, I've never met anybody that speaks that fast. And he said, well, that's why he has that job. So that's the first reading. Don't blink or you'll miss it. So anyways, first consideration, September 18th. It was laid on the table September the 18th. And, when I first went to the legislature, I didn't know what that meant. I said, what does it mean to lay it on the table? And they said, they take the bill and they put it on the table. They read it and it gets put on the table. And then the question is, does it get, removed from the table? Because it has to be removed from the table then and scheduled, and leadership controls the calendar. It has to be placed back on the calendar then for a second reading. So this had first consideration September 18th. It was laid on the table September 18th. And then guess what? September 24th, somebody picked it up off the table. Now, that means to me that it will be, at some point in the near future, be coming up for second consideration in the House. We're going back into session next Monday. So my guess is in the next week or two when we return, this will be brought up for second consideration. I shouldn't say in the House. It's actually a Senate bill. Oh, no, it's in the House now. Sorry about that. You're right. It's in the House now, so we will then be taking it up in another week or two once we get back, once they pull it up off of the table. So those are the two Senate bills that I wanted to go over. The first House bill I wanted to go over was House Bill 432, and this bill would amend the Workers' Compensation Act, and this deals with compensation for post-traumatic stress injuries. And I'll show you the co-sponsorship memo, and this was a co-sponsorship memo that was drafted. It looks like back on January the 15th. And Steve Barrar is the author of this. Now, Steve's been around a long time. He's chairman of the Veterans Affairs and Emergency Preparedness Committee, and Steve's actually going to be retiring. This is his last term in the House. So he said, in the near future, I will once again be introducing a bill to expand post-traumatic stress injury benefits for first responders in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. The prior legislation was House Bill 2664, which was introduced at the end, apparently, of the last session and didn't go anywhere. Under the bill, police officers, firefighters, emergency medical technicians, and paramedics would be entitled to benefits under the Pennsylvania Workers' Compensation Law for psychological injuries arising from their employment or after 4 years or more of service, regardless of whether the injury is accompanied by physical injuries requiring medical treatment. Then he goes on to talk about some of the terrible things that first responders witness and some of the things they go through. And as I was reading through this bill, one of the things that kind of caught my eye, the definition of post-traumatic stress injury shall mean a post-traumatic stress disorder as defined by a mental disorder characterized by direct exposure to a traumatic event as identified by the American Psychiatric Association and documented in the American Psychiatric Association's Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, known as the DSM, fifth edition. The other thing I thought was interesting about this was it says a post-traumatic stress injury suffered by a professional and volunteer firefighter, volunteer ambulance corps personnel, volunteer rescue and life-saving squad personnel, emergency medical services personnel and paramedics, telecommunicator, corrections officer, a Pennsylvania State Police officer, and a police officer requiring certification relating to employees shall be established by, and the old language said shall be established by a preponderance of evidence. Now, in the legal field, a preponderance of evidence, it's the lowest standard of proof. You have preponderance of the evidence, clear and convincing evidence, and then beyond a reasonable doubt. Beyond a reasonable doubt generally applies in criminal cases. Preponderance of the evidence generally applies in civil cases, and preponderance of the evidence merely means more likely than not, 51% to 49%, and that generally meets the standard of proof, which is preponderance. But they removed it, and when it said that it shall be established by preponderance of the evidence, they substituted shall be established by substantial competent evidence that the injury was caused by a direct exposure to a normal or abnormal working condition and was received while in the course of the individual's employment. I was a trial lawyer for 31 years. I have no idea what substantial competent evidence means, and it's not really defined in the bill either. My guess is that it's somewhat lower than preponderance of the evidence. It almost seems to me that if you have any evidence at all that is competent and has some substance to it, that would carry the burden of proof for proving the post-traumatic stress injury was related. And then it goes on to say a post-traumatic stress injury suffered by an individual shall be based on an examination and diagnosis by a psychologist or psychiatrist duly licensed under the laws of the Commonwealth. So at least you have to have a professional in the mental health field come up with that diagnosis. It also goes on to say, which is interesting, for purposes of this subsection, a post-traumatic stress injury suffered as a result of an employment action, including but not limited to disciplinary action, job or performance evaluation, job transfer or employment termination shall not be compensable. So if you get fired, you can't claim post-traumatic stress disorder because you were fired, unless it can be established by substantial competent evidence that the underlying cause of the employment action is directly attributable to the injury as provided for under this section. So if you had post-traumatic stress disorder and you claim that you were fired as a result of it, then you still have a potential claim for post-traumatic stress disorder as a result of the termination is the way that I read this. And again, by substantial competent evidence, which I don't know what that means, but I don't think it rises to the level of preponderance of the evidence. The history on this, it was referred to the Veterans Affairs and Emergency Preparedness Committee on February the 11th. It was amended, reported out September 24th, which is the same day it underwent first consideration in the House, and then it was laid on the table September the 24th. And the question is whether it comes off the table and is actually moved forward. That's always up to leadership. They can place things on the table and they can pull things off the table and bring them out anytime that they want for whatever reason. So if leadership wants that to move, it'll move. So the next bill I want to talk about is House Bill 442. I'll bring this one up. And this amends the Workers' Compensation Act as well. This was a co-sponsorship memo that was put out by Representative Kurt Sonny. He's from Erie. Am I doing okay on time? I'm good? Okay. You tell me when, give me the signal, I'll wrap it up. This is Representative Kurt Sonny from Erie. He's also chairman of the Education Committee. And he says in the near future, I'll be introducing legislation which will amend Section 601 of the Workers' Compensation Act to extend workers' compensation protection to members of emergency medical service agencies when not officially on duty. So he says specifically it would apply to anybody who's a member of an EMS agency, is certified by the Pennsylvania Department of Health as an EMS provider, renders emergency care, first aid, or rescue services at the scene of an emergency, and when rendering aid operates within their scope of practice, and while rendering aid is injured or dies while providing emergency care. So they're going to be covered now under the Workers' Compensation Statute. And this particular legislation was referred to the Labor and Industry Committee on February the 11th, 2019, and has not moved. So where that's going to end up, I don't know. Jim Cox, Representative Jim Cox, is the chair of the L&I, the Labor and Industry Committee. He's a good man, sits not far from me in the House. But that particular bill hasn't moved at all since it was referred to committee. The next bill is House Bill 1625, and House Bill 1625, this is the minimum auto limits bill. And this was, I was actually the first co-sponsor after Representative Aaron Coffer from Luzerne County who sponsored this. And he said he's going to be introducing this legislation. Motor vehicle insurance was mandated in 1974, and pursuant to that law, people were required to carry $15,000 of minimum coverage for bodily injury per person limits, $30,000 per accident, and $5,000 in property damage. He wants to increase that to $30,000 and $30,000 per person, $60,000 per accident, and $15,000 in property damage coverage. I jumped on this bill, and I'll tell you why. As a defense lawyer, oftentimes I was representing people who I didn't think, well, obviously didn't have sufficient coverage. And I saw people who would be in a car accident, they had $5,000, the minimum in property damage coverage, they would cause $12,000 or $13,000 damage to somebody else's vehicle, and the insurance carrier would tender the $5,000, of course, on their behalf to the injured party, and the injured party would accept that, or their insurance company would accept the $5,000, but then subrogate back against my client for the remaining $8,000 or $9,000. And I saw my clients in situations where, because they didn't have sufficient property damage coverage, there would be judgments entered against them. And once the judgments were entered against them, their licenses to operate a motor vehicle could be suspended as a result of non-payment of the judgment. So, but for the fact that these people didn't have a little bit more property damage coverage, they would lose their licenses until they could come up with a way to pay back the judgment. So I was a big supporter of this bill. It's been forever since we've increased those limits. You know, I'm not a huge fan of the trial lawyers, but I think that this affords more protection to those people who are involved in motor vehicle accidents, and it gives them sufficient coverage within which they can resolve claims made against them. So I thought it was a good bill. I really supported it. This was referred to the Transportation Committee, which I'm on, June the 12th. And then it was, there was a corrective reprint, which I don't even know what that means, but then it ended up getting sent over to the Insurance Committee, which I'm not a member of, but I know that Representative Coffer is a member of that committee. So it's been in insurance since June the 12th, and hasn't been brought up or considered by the committee that I'm aware of yet. The next bill, House Bill 1673, deals with, this is a relief funds for recruitment and retention of volunteers. And this is Representative Frank Ferry's bill. And his co-sponsorship memo says, in an effort to increase recruitment and retention efforts in volunteer fire companies throughout the Commonwealth, I am reintroducing legislation. Of course, you see a pattern. A lot of legislation just keeps getting reintroduced. That will expand the types of programs that relief monies can fund, as well as provide the Office of the State Fire Commissioner greater involvement in the relief fund process. One of the new programs will be known as the Length of Service Award Program, LOSAP, and is a system established to provide tax-deferred income benefits to active volunteer members of a fire service. One of the most practical benefits of a LOSAP is that it can be used as a tool to ensure retention of existing volunteer members and to provide incentives for recruiting new volunteer firefighters. In addition, my proposal provides that relief funds may be used for expenditures directly related to recruitment and retention programs. And this bill would also amend Title 35, which is the health and safety title, so that volunteer firefighters relief associations can ensure that funds are available for the assistance and protection of volunteer firefighters in order to provide necessary training and life preserving safeguards. Now, this bill was referred to Veterans Affairs and Emergency Preparedness on June the 24th. It was reported as committed September the 18th, so it came out without being amended in committee. First consideration was September 18th. It was laid on the table the same day and then removed from the table September 25th. So I'm assuming, again, that we'll see some second consideration of that bill when we get back next week or probably the week after. The next bill is House Bill 1786, which is the First Responder College Loan Forgiveness Bill. And this is Representative Chris Senato's bill, and his co-sponsorship memo says, when an emergency occurs, we expect our first responders to answer the call. Unfortunately, our safety and health are jeopardized by the declining number of volunteer firefighters. You can see that a lot of these bills deal with the fact that we've lost about 85 or 90% of our firefighters over the last 30 years or so. And he says, The First Responder Loan Forgiveness Program would target loan forgiveness to indebted college graduates who are active members of an emergency medical services agency, volunteer fire company, or volunteer rescue company. Up to $16,000 of the graduates' loans will be forgiven after 4 years of service. And this bill was referred to Veterans Affairs and Emergency Preparedness, where of course a lot of these bills go to that deal with fire companies and EMS. August the 30th, it was reported out as amended. September the 18th, first consideration that same day, and it was laid on the table that same day, removed from the table September 25th. So again, likely to see some movement on that bill in the next couple of weeks. So that's the pending bills that I was able to pull up and find. I know there was some discussion about Act 46, cancer in the occupation of firefighters. I'm not aware at this point of any movement to narrow the scope of that act, so that workers' comp insurers would be more actuarially comfortable re-entering the marketplace in Pennsylvania for municipal workers' comp with volunteer fire exposure. I'm not aware of any movement on that at all. I'm not aware of any bills that have been introduced. Now, one of the things to keep in mind is that we'll probably see 3,000 or 4,000 bills introduced this session, and maybe 300 or 400 of them will actually become law. So unless I'm personally involved with a bill, or unless it comes through a committee that I'm on, a lot of times I'm not aware of what legislation is out there unless I do some research or ask somebody to do some research for me. I don't think, though, that anything's been introduced to narrow that down in the workers' compensation arena. So that's something that might be a subject of a bill going forward. April's looking at me like, yeah. Get to it. But I don't think at this point that there's anything that's pending. How am I doing on time?
You're right there.
I'm there? All right. Well, listen, thanks a lot. It's great seeing all of you, and enjoy the rest of your morning.
I've been obviously in the workers' comp field for a long, long time. And I've talked to many of you. I talk all day long about workers' compensation with our clients. And people often say to me, how do you stay in this world for as long as you have? And I think I do because of the people I work with, the fact that I get to help clients understand this sometimes frustrating line of business, but also because every situation is unique and different. And it is, I guess, challenging for me to look at it and try to figure out what is best for the injured worker, for our clients, and at the end of the day, come up with the best result. So when I was preparing for this, what we're going to talk about, and one of the things that we wanted to make sure we did as we approached our agenda was to not just make this a seminar where we read out of a book about, oh, here's what workers' compensation insurance is, or here's what the Heart and Lung Act says. We wanted to give tips and techniques and really share with you what we believe is a best practice, or what strategies you can take away from today and actually put that into your own programs. So what I always start with is that slide that talks about the fact that insurance companies don't pay for employee injuries. The employers do. And the reason I start out that way is because I think some employers approach the workers' comp program as another benefit program and don't really understand that there are controllable components in that program, and that it's really up to you. The insurance carrier can help guide you, your insurance agent can help guide you, but there really are things within the workers' comp program that you need to kind of embrace and be the ones who run with. So when we start with the fact that workers' comp, obviously the workers' compensation insurance is going to pay for medical bills and wage loss. That's what's under your workers' comp policy. So because of that, work-related injuries have a direct impact. It's going to impact your workers' comp premium. So I need to stand in a place that I can see what slide I have up there. So is insurance the only cost of an accident? Obviously, this is really low. Obviously, there are other costs. I just said wage loss and medical bills. That's what is paid for under your workers' comp program. But if you look at that, all of the other expenses that come along with an employee being injured. So obviously, the employee is possibly out of work, so you have temporary costs. You have had to pay overtime for other people to fill that position. You have downtime. You have legal fees, not necessarily for the workers' compensation case, but many times there is crossover from the standpoint that you may have a workers' compensation case that ends up being denied or is in litigation, and when that happens, you possibly have employment-related issues going along with that that you have to have an attorney for. You have the cost of investigation time, the person who's responsible for talking to somebody like me about the claim, gathering information. So there is a lot of other expenses that don't fall under what is paid for in your workers' comp policy. You'll see this in periodicals and articles about workers' comp, but for the most part, people will say that that cost can be, for every dollar of your insured cost, can be $4 to $15 in uninsured costs. So when I say employers pay for their workers' comp, not only are you paying that workers' comp premium, but there are a lot of other things you're paying for as well. So let's talk about your experience mod. Anybody heard that term? Yes. So your experience mod factor, for those of you who are not familiar with that, is it's a rate designed to compare your historical exposure and loss information to other industries of your same kind. So when I talk about looking at your historical information, we're talking about looking back in time 3 years, and we're talking about the actual incurred losses. So what has been paid in workers' comp claims, as well as what's in reserve for those workers' comp claims. So they take that, they look at your payroll, and they're looking back in 3 years of time and coming up with this experience mod factor that's going right into your workers' comp premium calculation. So here's an example. I know it's probably hard to see from a distance, but you can see that if you were talking about unmodified premium of about $100,000 in that first part, and it's showing you that you have an experience mod factor of 1. So a 1 means that you're average. In comparing yourselves to other municipalities or other organizations of your like kind, you are a C if we were talking about grades in school. You can see that $100,000 premium with a mod of 1 is $100,000. So now let's look at somebody who has a mod over a 1. So that would mean that you are a little worse than your peers because you're above a 1. And you can see at a mod of about a 1.4 what that's doing to your premium. So that $100,000 now has become $144,000. So you can see the impact that a poor mod can have on your workers' comp premium. Now, the other end of that is seeking a mod below a 1, which would make you a little better than your peers from a loss perspective or experience mod perspective. You can see what impact that has on that $100,000 premium. So for me, my goal when I get involved with clients is to seek that result. Let's try to get that mod below a 1. And one of the things that I don't know that people really think about, I mean, if you thought the process through or if you were sitting down and reading more about experience mods, there is a portion of your mod that's within your control. Obviously, the payroll part of that is what it is, but the loss part of that you can affect by preventing losses from ever happening and managing the cases that do happen. So if you look at that illustration, we always like to show clients what their controllable mod is because it's an interesting part to the whole process. And you can see here, it's showing you that in your mod, there's a minimum, just like in a lot of things. Every type of industry has a minimum mod, so you can't get any better than that number. This is showing you how much of your mod, keeping that minimum in the back of your mind. That red part is showing in those examples how much of the mod is within the control of this organization. So obviously, in that historical illustration, it's showing you that there is still a nice chunk of your mod that you could affect positively. And that's where today's discussion comes in. How can we affect that positively? So I like to break it down like this. I like to talk about what you should do before injuries ever happen, and I like to talk about what you should do when somebody reports an injury. To me, it does sound common sense. It sounds as though something will certainly, that's what we always do. That's what we do. But how you do that and how quickly you do that can really have an impact on how the claim will be resolved. So let's talk about before an incident occurs. Obviously, everybody in here, we're talking about Pennsylvania as a jurisdiction. So in Pennsylvania, we are in a jurisdiction that doesn't afford a ton of rights to the employer as it relates to workers' comp. So we like to grab hold of anything we can. And one of those things in Pennsylvania is being able to post a physician panel. And posting the physician panel for some, it can be as simple as you get your workers' comp policy from one of our partners here, you pull out the suggested panel, and you post it on your board. But there are some specifics associated with that I want you to be aware of and make sure that you're doing so that at the end of the day, that works out for you. Along that same line, there are some other postings that I always like to remind people of. In that same insurance policy will be a form called an LIBC 500. It's an insurance posting. But when your insurance carrier or the state comes through, they're going to look on your board to see if that posting's up there. So you want to make sure that wherever you're posting that panel, you're also posting that LIBC form. The next is notifying employees of the physician panel. We'll talk a little bit about what steps need to be taken to properly notify employees of that. And the last thing is the workers' comp information form, which is a form that we'll also discuss that when we're notifying employees of the panel, you might as well notify employees of this workers' compensation information. So let's start with the physician panel. Obviously, I mean, it's self-explanatory. It's a list of physicians. There are some rules, and I'll keep this high level, but you have to have at least 6 physicians on that. Obviously, you want to make sure that those physicians that you are listing are a variety of specialties. You also want to make sure that those physicians are ones who are known to treat occupational injuries. So if for whatever reason, your panel that's been provided has a number of family physicians on it, nothing against family physicians, but from an occupational perspective may not be the best at treating those occupational injuries. So you just want to make sure that from a communication standpoint, from a specialty standpoint, that you've got the right doctors on there. You also want to make sure that you understand that putting that panel up gives you the right to direct treatment for the first 90 days. That's an important thing because being able to control where that injured worker goes to seek treatment and having a relationship with those doctors to be able to get frequent communication regarding those appointments is an important step in this. So again, the posting of this panel allows you for 90 days a lot of good interaction relative to that injury. You also want to know that after 90 days, that employee can look at you and say, forget it, we're not seeing these doctors anymore. We are going to go ahead and go see whatever doctor. And that's their right after 90 days. Your goal should be to take care of that, manage that claim, and get that person back to work and the injury resolved before the 90 days. Then you don't have to worry about that piece of this. So how do you properly notify employees? And this is the piece that sadly, when I meet with new clients, I will find out that this is the part that didn't happen. So I am here to remind everybody of this important component in the law. In order to be able to show that you properly notified your employees that you have a physician panel, you need to have them sign off on what's called a rights and duties form, both at time of hire and time of injury. So what that rights and duties form, most carriers have mimicked the state form. There's different versions of it, but usually at the top it says rights and duties or something along those lines, and usually has blocks at the bottom that are saying at time of hire, time of injury, and then it'll say other. And it's really just going through for the injured worker or for the employee at time of hire, the fact that you have a physician panel, here are your rights and duties under that, the fact that you have a right for a second opinion if somebody recommends surgery, all of those things are outlined. So the employee at time of hire is going to sign that. Then if they are injured, they need to sign that same form 2 times. So at time of hire, you're going to have them sign it, you're going to stick it in their file, and then if for some reason they are injured, you have them sign it the second time. It is important to do that because if it would happen that this is a claim where the employee says, forget it, I'm not going to treat with your doctor, I'm going to my own doctor. If you want to be able to push back to say, look, we have a panel and you need to treat with the doctor on the panel, the only way you can show that is by pulling out those 2 forms to say, well, you signed off on this and it was clearly outlined to you on this rights and duties form. Does that make sense? So one of the things that I want everybody to make sure that they think about is, do I have that? And if not, you're going to want to get that form out, and there's an other block on those forms too, and just have them sign it and mark it other, and you can kind of start fresh. The insurance posting is in your workers' comp policy. Just pull that out. Make sure you have that posted wherever you have that panel. And we'll go on to the next section. I'm talking fast, so stop me if you have questions, but I want to keep up because we have a lot of other good things. The first 24 hours after somebody is injured is a critical time for employers. A lot of times an employer will get the paperwork, push it off to the insurance carrier, and think, phew, we got it reported, we're done. But to me, that's your time to shine. That first 24 hours before the insurance carrier really has activated their resources is when you need to do so much. And I reinforce that with people because to me, it's like those shows, First 48 Hours, and the different shows that are on TV. In the world of workers' comp, it's really the time that you need to step up, or whoever's responsible in your organization to step up and do a number of things. So what do you do first? Obviously, the part that is most important is to look at that injured worker and make sure if they need medical care, you deal with that. You get them to the right doctor, have somebody take them to the doctor. If it's emergent, they need to get to an emergency room. You want to make sure that after they meet with at the emergency room or go to the doctor, that you're sitting down and explaining things to them. So a lot of people, what happens is, look, we got a report, they apparently went to the emergency room last night. And that's where the information ends. And you really need more than that. You need to gather what's going on. You need to understand, okay, so what did the emergency department tell you? You need to refer them back into your panel. You need to understand if they're to be off work. These days, people a lot of times will just come back to work. And so you'll say, okay, or did they tell you you can work? And well, I don't know. They gave me all these printouts and, the pictures of the rice and, putting ice on things. And somewhere embedded in that information, it usually says, follow up in 3 days with your family doctor, or, be off work for 2 days and then return to your regular duty. It is very, very important to understand if the person is able to come back to work. especially for all of you with your highway guys or with your police officers, what's going to happen is they come right back to work and they just start doing their job again. But you really need to understand if they're supposed to be doing that full duty job. You want to make sure that you start that accident investigation. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this. I just included the slide because it's an important aspect of what you should do initially. So when somebody reports an injury, you want to walk down through why. How did it happen? Where did it happen? Why did it happen? What do you believe was the cause of that? Gathering information. I know investigation in the world of workers' comp sometimes is taken as though you think you're looking at the person as placing blame or that you're pointing a finger to say, you idiot, why did you do that? It's not for that purpose. It is a fact-gathering process where you just want to make sure that you've gathered all the information because it is critical for you internally, for your safety committees, for your safety folks, for you to understand what happened, why it happened, and how we stop that from happening again. You don't want someone else to get injured that same way. So gathering information to get to the root cause is an important step. Putting corrective actions in place is an important step. It also helps in the processing of the claim because you want to put in front of the adjuster when they do get assigned and they do start making those calls, you have all the facts in front of you. Here's what we found out. Here's what the doctor said. Here's what we're going to do. So this is just kind of the what, where, when, why questions. Most important being why. I always tell safety committees, especially certified safety committees in the state, and I know Doug's going to talk about that, but one of their responsibilities is to get to the root cause of things. And the 5 why process, to me, is the easiest to explain to people that are looking at me like, yeah, I don't know what you do to get to a root cause. Just keep asking why. If you can't ask why anymore, you probably are at the root cause of something. But it's important to do that because looking at what the primary cause, usually there's something underneath that. So when you say somebody slipped and fell, there's a lot more whys under that than just I slipped and fell. So the next step, return to work. This, I can tell you, and I feel like I've earned the right after my 30 plus that I don't like to admit to, but I feel like I've earned the right to say this. I can tell you the #1 way to affect your bottom line in your workers' comp program positively is through a return to work program. And I know that there are all kinds of debates in this. Well, our union won't let them, they come back, they're not fully able to, and they're going to get hurt again. Well, other people don't like to see somebody just sitting there doing nothing. I get it. I understand it. I just want you to know the #1 way for you to positively impact your workers' comp program is through a return to work program. There could be different aspects of that, but creating a return to work program is essential for you to walk away with a mod that you're happy with. The goals you can see there, you want to get people back, you want to reduce the number of litigated claims, you want to reduce the number of lost work days, you want to increase employee morale and motivation. Those are all reasons why you should have it. If you look here, you can see that if you are letting somebody off work to sit at home, to do whatever they want, if you let me off work, I would be the same way. It would be hard to come back to work if I had that freedom. The longer they're out of work, the harder it's going to be to get them back. This is a chart that you see at a lot of workers' comp things. I think Liberty Mutuals, who originally put this illustration out, but it is showing you that at 12 weeks, employees have only a 50% chance of returning to work. So it gets harder and harder. So the goal is don't let them ever get out of work. It is human nature when you have that freedom, you're not working, you're collecting your money. Oh, it's tough. So let's look at the reasons when you look at it from the employer's perspective. reduces the indemnity costs, that loss experience is improved, it reduces future premium increases, that employee morale, sense of security and loyalty, minimizes productivity losses when somebody is out and you have to try to fill in for their replacement, reducing costs, overtime wages, new employee training, the potential for litigation. For the employee, there are benefits as well. Maintaining income, being out of work, they don't have money coming in, providing a sense of security and stability, reinforcing management commitment to employee welfare, reinforcing the daily work habit. So you'll hear people talk, your adjuster may even talk to you about this. Once somebody gets that, oh, I'm going to sleep in, I'm going to have some free time in the morning, you want to get people up and get them back to work. Keep them engaged. Discourage the disability mentality. Discourages malingering. Provides positive reinforcement of quick recovery. I always say, no, obviously I'm in the workers' comp world, but you ever wonder why all of those attorney ads are on TV? Well, there's people sitting at home watching those, and before you know it, you get the letter of representation, and boom, now you have a litigated case. Safe rehab program, getting somebody back, slowly rehabilitating them back into their full-duty job. So the financial impact, disability is defined as a loss of actual earnings or earning capacity as a consequence of an injury or disease. So I'm going to let my co-presenter Robert talk a little bit more, but here's the thing. In Pennsylvania, you have to be able to show that you have work available or job availability in order to move that case along positively. So it all gets wrapped up in what the doctor's saying, what job you have available, or else the Workers' Comp Act in Pennsylvania states that they are going to get paid. So let's talk about, well, this is just going, and I already talked about the experience mod, but it's just talking about the fact that this has obviously an impact on your mod, and then it's going to have an impact on your premium because we talked about how your mod affects your premium. So when should you offer modified duty? As soon as possible. And the reason I say as soon as possible is for a reason that Robert's going to go through. But in Pennsylvania, there's a waiting period for workers' comp injuries. You have 7 days. There's a 7-day waiting period. On the 8th day, workers' comp kicks in. After the 14th day, they go back and pick up the first 7. So in that 7-day window, you have the ability to bring that person back to light duty before a check ever gets issued, before payments get initiated. If you can keep it within that waiting period, then it's what we consider a medical-only claim because they've not lost enough time for wage loss. So when you have that injury, gathering that information, investigating that claim, finding out if they're to follow up, that's a critical, from a timing standpoint, that's a critical thing to keep in back of your mind. Because here's the thing, once you start paying in Pennsylvania, you can't just unilaterally stop paying unless you get that full duty release or you have gotten them back with no wage loss. So the goal here should be, let's get them back to work before that waiting period is up, and then we have a little more control of that. And I'm talking very high level, so obviously there's a lot of specifics behind that. But for your purposes, understanding that you want to try to do it within that time frame is what I want you to leave with. So what you should be looking for is, what can we do? What can we bring them back? What tasks are available? Even if it's to come back for half a day or part of a day, just to keep that going and to get them back to work. You also want to make sure you have the right team of people. So I may be talking to Vicki at Logan Township about bringing somebody back. But if there's no one behind Vicki at Logan Township supporting that, it's not going to work. So when you create a return to work or a light duty program, everybody needs to be on board. The supervisors, the department heads, everybody needs to be on board. So you want to make sure that's the first thing that you want to make sure happens. You want to make sure that the doctors on your physician panel are willing to release people to light duty. They need to understand that, so that when somebody goes to one of those doctors, obviously if medically they're not able to or not stable enough to, they won't, but if they can, they're going to release them even if it's to sedentary duty. There are certain forms that you need to be mindful of, and by this point in time, an adjuster has probably been assigned to the case and will start talking to you about that. But your goal should be that when that adjuster calls you, you can say, here's where the doctor they went to, here's the job we've offered them, I've already sent out an offer letter, and the adjuster's job has become much easier. Not that your goal is to make it easier, but they're able to make a decision on this case much better because of the steps you have already taken. There is a form, and this is another piece. The adjuster should be telling you this, but in order for you to make an offer, an adjuster, as a case goes forward, the adjuster needs to issue a form, a bureau document. And I have it listed up there, but just understand the logistics of that. That notice of ability to return to work bureau form needs to be issued prior to you making the offer. Now, when it's up front within the first 7 days, we're not really worried about that as much, but if somebody has come back initially and you're waiting to get them back and you're about to make an offer and send that letter out, you need to make sure the adjuster has sent that form out before your letter has or your offer has gone out. And that's something you can coordinate with your adjuster, but quite honestly, some adjusters aren't talking about that with you, so you need to bring that up if they need to issue that form. Okay? Understanding what the physical components of an employee's pre-injury job are also important. These days, people I know have worked to improve job descriptions, but quite frankly, there's a lot of organizations, you pull out a job description and it'll have must be able to lift 100 pounds, and that's about all that's on there. You need to make sure that if your job descriptions aren't inclusive of everything that somebody should do, then you should have somebody who's familiar with that job walk down through and create a form like this, which is a pre-injury job analysis, is just talking about what the person has to do physically. That's the form we want to get in front of the doctor to get them back to work at their full duty capacity. The physician is then going to say, okay, I don't think they're ready for that, but they're going to fill out something that looks somewhat like this that says, okay, here's what they can go back to. Those are the two documents, whether it's written in narrative form or looks like this, that you need to say, here's what the job looks like, here's what the doctor says you can do, and the light duty is somewhere in between. But you want to make sure that you're communicating. Sometimes they'll get released and there's one thing on that full duty list that they can't do. But let's say that one thing was to do a task that 20 years ago you did on that job, but they don't do it anymore. So that's a pertinent thing to bring up. You want to make sure that you're communicating those things, because at the end of the day, getting that person released to full duty and back into a capacity where they don't need to follow up is what you want to do. And the last thing, I talk about offer letters. For those of you who are clients in the room, you get sick of me saying, did you do an offer letter? It is a critical thing. And you will send out 10 offer letters that there's an employee has returned, there's no problems, but somewhere along the line, you will have an employee who, when you offer that job, will say, yeah, I'm not coming back. And if that case goes into litigation, that letter with the right language in it is what's going to save you in litigation to support that you had a job available. It is critical, right down to the words that are in it and the fact that you mail it regular mail and certified mail. So when you are offering light duty, this letter should just be part of that practice. So I know I said a lot of information in a little amount of time, but that information, you have only a little amount of time to do it too. But that's what should be going through your head that first day when somebody gets injured. When the adjuster gets involved, they'll take over. Robert's going to talk to you about those next steps, compensability. None of that should matter. You need to get them back. Even if you find out that it's not a workers' comp case and it gets denied, at least you have postured yourself appropriately if it goes into litigation.
First of all, I want to thank Teeter Group for allowing me to even present today. I really appreciate that. It's an important subject for every one of us. And I love April's concept of the story, because we are creating a story with everything that we do as partners in trying to resolve the issues that come before us in workers' compensation and every other aspect of your insurance program. It is a story. So we really need to work together as partners to create a happy ending to our story and keep it a short story to the best of our ability. Okay, so there's a lot on this, and when Barb and I tried to put this together, we all got all these great ideas, and you end up with 9 million slides and just 40 minutes to do it all in. So we're going to pour through this, and I want to bring you inside the mind of a claims person a little bit. Okay, and everything that Barb said, absolutely true. But I just want you to realize it's not all on you. Okay, your claims person, whoever that may be, is to be your partner from the moment you report that claim, and to work with you through the process of all those aspects that Barb was explaining to you. You're not alone, and you should never be made to feel that way. So, what is covered? Injuries suffered in the course and scope of employment. Course and scope is used as a phrase that covers almost everything that ever happens, but I like to think of it as the course as being: where were they when the injury happened? What were they doing? Were they where they should be, doing what they should be doing? In scope, I like to think of as how did it happen? Is it something that really is part of what their work should be? And this is it seems like a minor thing, but keep this in mind. Although an injury or symptoms may be alleged, an injury needs to be diagnosed by a medical provider where there's no injury. So if an employee says to you, I hurt my shoulder, if they don't go see a doctor, there's no injury, because an employee can't decide their injury. And you can't decide their injury, nor can we. A doctor runs the show in workers' compensation. They must see a physician, and that's why what Barb was saying about having a panel and getting them there, you shouldn't be guessing, are they injured? Can they do their job? You should not be guessing about any of that stuff. Let a doctor tell you those things. Get them to a doctor. Okay, what are the benefits? Payment of lost wages, totally or partially. Work, and I'm going to go back to something Barb said. Return to work programs, yes, they're wonderful. If you have a municipality where you have very few employees, you're wondering, how could I possibly have a return to work program? Be committed to the concept of return to work, and speak with your adjuster once a claim is reported to see what could possibly be available. And seriously, even if it's 1 day a week, 3 hours a day, 3 times a week, whatever it is that you can find someone something to do is helpful in creating the story ending that we want. Okay, and it benefits all of us. And then there's compensation is 2/3 of their average weekly wage. There's death benefits for surviving dependents, and then there's a thing called specific loss benefits. A lot of employers don't realize this. They'll bring someone back to work within that 7-day waiting period and say, goody, we don't owe them anything, and we're helping to control that mod. Well, if they lost half of their finger because they got caught in the tailgate of a dump truck, there is these things called specific loss benefits where they are entitled under the law to a certain number of weeks for the loss of that digit. For toes, there's a whole section of the Act that governs these things. And this is because Pennsylvania was a highly industrial state originally when the Work Comp Act was passed. And a lot of people lost limbs and lost digits because of all the machinery that they worked with. So That's a benefit that's out there. Again, it's something your adjuster will talk to you about and help explain to you, but realize it's out there, okay? Let's see here. Medical benefits, it has to be related, reasonable, and necessary, okay? We call it RR&N. We use that acronym constantly in documenting our files. Employees are not responsible for any kind of balance due. Providers sometimes don't like what they're getting paid under the fee schedule of Pennsylvania, but they have to realize that they're only entitled to what they're entitled to under the law, and they can't go to the employee. And medical, this is important. Medical for an accepted injury is a lifetime benefit in Pennsylvania. So there's a lot that goes into trying to close that loop by getting a doctor to say they're fully recovered, they don't need any more treatment. Then you could try to say, well, if you're fully recovered, you shouldn't need any more treatment 4 years from now. That's what you try to accomplish to close that down. Time limits. I don't want to get too deep into this. I'm going to go through a bunch of these because they're really not necessary for you to know. But we talked about 21 days. Under the law, you have 21 days to accept or deny a claim. We try, as a carrier, and I think most carriers do, to do that within 14 days. And the idea is, I mean, no one could be without a check for 2 weeks. That would bring my household to a crash if I went 2 weeks without a check. That would put the bills behind. It creates a lot of issues. So we try to do it within 14 days. So from the time you report it, if you report it immediately, we get it, the adjuster's assigned, boom, we're off and running. We're making things happen. Okay? An employee has 120 days, or they could be banned from, or barred from receiving benefits. That's a very loosely interpreted thing. If an employee says to their supervisor, Jack, I hurt my shoulder, that's reported. Okay? That's all they need to show is that they told someone in authority it happened, and that would be sufficient. There's more fun things to get to than this. I'm just going to go through here real quickly. 21 days, but it's not that important. Okay, if a denial is issued, they have 3 years to file a petition to contest the denial of the claim. We try very hard to investigate a claim and not deny them frivolously because we do not want people getting attorneys. That just increases everybody's cost and everybody's aggravation in trying to create the story that we want to create. And these are appeals, not that important. We're getting to some better stuff here. Okay. After the how, why, who, what, when, and where, how does a claims person get to deciding if a claim is compensable? So we got, does the injury arise in the course and scope of employment? I have some interesting scenarios to talk to you when we get to another slide. Does it arise from the scope of employment? Do we accept the claim, accept it temporarily, or do we deny it? Okay, temporary acceptance is done via a notice of temporary compensation payable. This is the greatest thing that we have been given by the legislature in Pennsylvania as a claims person. Prior to 1996, we had to decide within 14 days whether to accept the claim essentially forever or deny it and go into litigation with all the costs associated. We now have a thing called temporary compensation. So when we're not certain, and there's things that we just have to dig into further to complete further investigation, rather than deny a claim that seems like it might be compensable, we're just not certain at this point, we can temporarily accept it for 90 days, which gives us an opportunity to request prior medicals, get an exam if we need it. It's a very fair approach. It gets the worker benefits while we continue the investigation and gives us the opportunity at the end of that 90 days to make a formal decision at that point in time. These are all things you have to look into for an investigation. This is why it could take time, and you may need 90 days. Okay? Is it an aggravation or a recurrence of a prior problem? An aggravation of a pre-existing condition in Pennsylvania is considered an injury. So keep that in mind. So if someone's had bad back pain, off and on, they've treated for it in the past, and now they go to lift, a 75-pound bag of rock salt and they hurt their back, That's, even though they had a back problem before and it's the same part of their back, it's considered a new injury, okay? We have to determine whether it goes back to a prior injury that maybe they had even under a prior carrier or a prior employer. There's a lot to dig into here. So prior injuries, prior treatment becomes important. Prior symptoms, prior complaints, prior absences, recent pre-injury activities, very important. Claims people can be a pain in the neck sometimes. I'm sure you guys, when you talk with them, they're asking for work, you know, do you have modified duty, do you know this, do you know that? And many times it's like, I don't know any of these things. Put up with us, okay? Because the practice of us asking for that information is necessary because we want to get these answers. If you do know one or two of those things, it's helpful to us to go down a certain course of investigation. All these things are going to be asked of the injured employee. And it's a nice reference. If we get two different answers, we have to reconcile that. We get to the bottom. Okay, volunteer firefighters. Course and scope complexities with volunteer firefighters. Course and scope is generally a fairly easy question to answer when you're dealing with a road worker. They're shoveling the blacktop, they're raking, they're where they should be, they're doing what they should be doing. It's a relatively easy question to answer. It becomes a little more complex with volunteer firefighters. There's certain clearly covered duties under Section 601A of the Workers' Comp Act. I actually made a copy of that section of the Act, and I do have a supply of it here if anyone wants it, and I want to run through this real quick. If they're actively engaged as a fireman or going to and from a fire, obviously covered. If they're involved in training, obviously covered. If it's maintenance of the facilities, the fire engines, all the equipment, obviously covered. If they're on emergency calls or while riding upon fire vehicles, they're obviously covered if injured. And then there's these things called other duties, okay, that are authorized by the municipality. And that gets down to what is another duty? Fundraising, is that a duty that should or should not be covered? These are questions that make it a little harder to answer because volunteers get involved in far more varied duties than you would normally run into with just a regular road worker. So there's a case called Mahoning Valley versus Work Comp Appeal Board. And that determined that there needs to be express authorization for the duties that a volunteer is performing if they're injured in them for there to be coverage. Now, how do you get express authorization? Where does that come from? It can't come from the fire leadership because the fire leadership are not, quote unquote, the person that's going to be responsible for the insurance and the costs of covering that thing. It's the municipality. So express authorization needs to come from the municipality, and there's several ways that you can accomplish that. And in our experience, one of the most effective ways was through board meeting minutes. You know, an adjuster's wondering, is this covered? Is it not? I mean, should they be there? You know, does it matter that they were there? What's that got to do with firefighting? There's all these questions floating around in our mind. The easiest thing is for us to be able to go back to board meeting minutes, the annual calendar of events, and say, boom, 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 here are all the events that the fire company plans to be involved in the coming year. They're in the minutes, approved by the board, no questions to be asked. It's a much simpler situation. If none of that is authorized in advance, then you're running around trying to figure out, did the municipality know they were doing this? Did the municipality want them to be doing it? Does the municipality intend for them to be covered under workers' comp while they're in this activity? It becomes a very much more complicated situation. I've run into, and this is very, very rare, but a thing called enabling legislation where some municipalities actually formally and legally extend authority to the fire leadership, essentially saying, we have a close relationship, whatever you guys decide is necessary to sustain yourselves, whatever those activities are, you're covered doing those activities. I've only seen that once in our experience, and I'm not sure how many municipalities would even dream of doing something like that, but it is something that I ran across, and we were quite shocked, actually. It was a situation where we didn't think that it was something that should be covered or intended to be covered, but here there was this piece of legislation in the municipality that extended that authority to the fire leadership. So things to be aware of. Let me see what else we got here. Here's some interesting scenarios to talk about. And we're 5 minutes over into our break. We're going to go through these. These are fun. Okay, a volunteer firefighter falls down steps at firehouse. Does that sound like it should be compensable? Covered. Well, in our investigation in this situation, we found out that this volunteer firefighter was living at the firehouse. Well, it had nothing to do with an alarm, had nothing to do with a fire. They were living there. Somebody wanted to give them, I guess they were having difficulties. They were homeless or had problems at home, didn't want to be at home for whatever reason, and the fire leadership said, hey, why don't you live upstairs? You can hang out here. So when we determined that they were not doing anything with regard to that, that was a case that we denied. Okay? And I'm sure that the carrier, whoever they are at that point in time, there's an extra exposure there if you're letting people live in this property. So that was an issue. A volunteer firefighter falls from ladder painting a fire hall. Sounds like that would be maintenance of the property. And you dig into it through the investigation, and we find out that it was a hall, not the firehouse, and it was basically painting the bathroom of the hall, and it had nothing to do with updating the equipment. That was a close call. Do you or don't you accept that? I don't remember what we did. I think we denied it. Okay. Volunteer firefighter falls down steps at home. Covered. Because an alarm went off, he went rushing down the steps, fell down the steps, broke their ankle. Covered. Because he was responding to an alarm. Okay, workers, now this is not a firefighter, but the worker sneezes at work and injures their eye. Very strange. It was covered, and that's the case. Carroll versus Workers' Comp Appeal Board. Apparently, they were in a meeting. The pressure of sneezing, maybe trying to backed up into their eye, and they had an eye injury. Very strange, but it was covered. Police officer injures back working out. This was an interesting situation. We want our police officers to be fit. We want them to be strong, to be able to protect us, okay, and give us the safety that we need from them. So it's reasonable for them to be working out under many, many circumstances. And I think there's even, if I'm not mistaken in this case, we even ran into a situation where part of their gym membership fee might have been subsidized by the municipality because they want them to be able to maintain their health and their strength. In this particular case, however, the working out was the officer jumping from the floor repeatedly up to a 36-inch height table, okay? He was doing it, and he shared this with us, and he was very open and honest in his statement. Essentially, he was training to do a marathon and like an MMA type of event where you are doing rugged sports types things. So it wasn't for the purpose of his job, it was for a personal thing that he was training for. That got a little difficult. We denied it, but we ended up paying because it probably was going to go that way. And that was another thing I want to mention to you. We hear about litigation, we hear this, that, and the other thing. Nobody makes money going to court over these things. It's the worst thing any of us can have happen. And almost all cases, however questionable, get resolved before they ever go to a judge making a decision on it. Because we want to write the story. We want to write the story in a way that has a reasonable outcome for everybody. And I've always felt, and I don't know if there's anything else left here. Okay, let me just do this last one. Worker alleges bilateral plantar fasciitis walking on a plant floor. We deny it. Plantar fasciitis is something anybody can get. You can get it walking to your car. You walk your whole life. So it's, sometimes you wonder why people bring these things up. Maybe someone said to them, hey, maybe you could get comp. I'm not sure why they bring forth this alleged injury, but there's certain things that just are not clearly related to your employment. And walking would be one of them, because everyone has to walk everywhere we go. That's the end of it. But I wanted to make mention of the fact that no matter what we do, we have to get a story written that benefits the carrier, the municipality, and the worker. Because I'll tell you, and Barb even mentioned it. Why does she do what she does after 30 plus years? Long and the short of it is we help people. We help people move on from a difficult situation, and that's usually the injury. No matter what the issues are, our job, all of us collectively, is to help move on beyond that event and write a good ending to the story. That's the whole purpose of everything that we do. And I think by and large, we do it by working together. So thank you very much.
Some of this may be a little basic. I was told to basically put together a presentation as if people didn't understand heart and lung at all. So if anybody has experience, I apologize if it's a little bit duplicative on some of the minor issues. The first thing is, despite its name, the Heart and Lung Act, this is not a law that pertains solely to injuries to the cardiac system or respiratory system. There's Section B of the Act, and this may be where it derives its name, where it talks about the presumption for tuberculosis as well as diseases of the heart. It's arguable whether or not the actual presumption applies to diseases of the heart. It definitely applies to tuberculosis, but there's a special section that deals with those two conditions that may be where it derived its name from. But this does cover any and all injuries that are suffered in the performance of an officer's job duties. Now, as Barb indicated, she said some people say we don't have heart and lung claims. But if you're one of the employers that's covered by the Heart and Lung Act, and you have an employee covered by the Heart and Lung Act, you're going to have a heart and lung claim. It's not an elective law, it's mandatory. It provides extra benefits. Now, Barb also talked about, from the workers' comp standpoint, you have that waiting period of 7 days before an injury is actually compensable. Then you have the additional 7 days where if you're injured for 8 days, you get 1 day. Then if you go to up to 15, you relate back to day 1. That's not the case with heart and lung benefits. You could have an officer injured, a firefighter injured, they miss just a day or two, and they're entitled to benefits from day 1 under the Heart and Lung Act. So even though it would be typically a medical-only claim under workers' compensation, they would be entitled to wage loss benefits in terms of their full salary from day 1. What's interesting, though, we'll get into this a little bit later about how it impacts the law compared to workers' compensation. This law wasn't actually created for the benefit of the injured workers. It was actually created for the benefit of the municipalities. They wanted to give incentive for people to go into these high-risk professions, so they wanted to provide this additional incentive that they'll get their full pay regardless of suffering an injury, as long as it's in the performance of their job duties. So who are the classes of employees that are potentially entitled to heart and lung benefits? You'll see there's a number of different departments listed for the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, different types of employees. I bolded down near the bottom the ones that will most likely be applicable here, which are policemen, firemen, park guards of any county, city, borough, town, or township. So if you're running a county, city, borough, town, or township, if you have a policeman, fireman, or park guard that are injured in performance of their job duties, they're going to be qualified for heart and lung benefits. In 2006, the Act was also amended to include sheriffs and deputy sheriffs. With regards to firemen, once again, there's a number on there that are dealing with the Commonwealth only. The top 3 appear to be most likely for this group. Paid firemen not employed by the Commonwealth. Now, the second one's kind of interesting. Emergency medical services personnel, but it says employed by city fire departments. So if you have EMS and they're separate from the city fire department, technically they wouldn't qualify under the Heart and Lung Act. But what you do see sometimes is EMS personnel that are separate trying to negotiate a provision, sometimes through a collective bargaining agreement, where they say, look, why should emergency medical service personnel employed by city fire departments be entitled to full salary, but just because we're not under the city fire department, we're not. So I have seen situations where that's been something written into a collective bargaining agreement. Now, whenever you do that, you're providing an additional benefit, which you're allowed to do, but they're still entitled, obviously, to workers' comp, as would any individual entitled to heart and lung benefits. And one of the things that I know my clients have done is whenever they do agree to a provision, agreeing to provide EMS personnel with full salary benefits, they may write into that provision, since it's a contractual benefit now as opposed to one that's statutory under the law, that they'll cap that at a year and say once a year passes, it's no longer, quote, temporary, so that benefit then expires. So under the Heart and Lung Act, benefits are also, well, there's certain categories of employees that may look like they're entitled to benefits, but they're not. Specifically cadets. If somebody's still going through the training, is not yet an officer, is not yet a firefighter, they're not yet qualified to receive the heart and lung benefits if they're injured while a cadet. Also, once the officer retires or the person entitled to benefits retires, they're no longer of the class of employees who's entitled to receive such benefits. So those benefits do stop at that period of time. Volunteer firefighters also aren't covered by the Heart and Lung Act currently. Also, the discharged employees, as we'll discuss a little bit later. Of course, you can't just discharge somebody saying, hey, you suffered a heart and lung injury, so now we're going to discharge you, and that's not going to relieve your obligations. It has to be for some other legitimate reason. So what does it take to actually qualify for heart and lung benefits? Well, the first, the injury must occur in the performance of the claimant's job duties. We'll get into that. It's a little bit different than under workers' compensation. Also, they must be, quote, temporarily incapacitated. Once again, another term of art, which we'll discuss here in a little bit more detail. So, as was talked about earlier, under workers' compensation, you have wage loss, you have entitlement to medical benefits. Same thing applies under the Heart and Lung Act. You have wage loss benefits, which is your full salary continuation, including any raises that one would receive. Also, it provides for all medical and all hospital bills. Another thing, the next section, this is actually, the Heart and Lung comes in two different statutes, 537, 538. 538 actually provides for continued accumulation of vacation, sick, personal, and other leave time. However, if you look at it, it actually limits that to Commonwealth employees, which I'm not sure why there's a distinction there as opposed to applying to everybody, but it does just apply for Commonwealth employees. Things that are not payable under the Heart and Lung Act, as we discussed earlier, you have specific loss benefits, such as if you lose a portion of your finger or a digit or a leg or an arm. Also death benefits and burial expenses. Those are things that are provided for under workers' comp. However, just because you have a heart and lung claim, you still also have those potential entitlements to benefits under the Workers' Compensation Act. So what wage loss benefits are actually payable? If you look at the actual language of the statute, it's pretty convoluted. It's actually in the back of the packet I put together, and it goes through all those different categories of employers. But if you boil it down to the specific language, it says they shall be paid their full rate of salary as is fixed by ordinance or resolution. So what does it actually mean? It means essentially if they're paid by an hourly rate, take 40 times that hourly rate. Sometimes you'll see these employees that they have a monthly salary or a weekly salary. You're going to take that number and you're trying to boil it down to what is it on a weekly basis. Now there's no specific guidance as to under workers' compensation, you pay based upon an average weekly wage. So if a person misses 7 days, you pay 7 days. That includes those days off that they wouldn't be working on a Saturday or Sunday or whatever their past days are. What we typically do for heart and lung is we just say 1/5. So we figure out what that full salary amount is for that week. And then if they miss an actual work day, pay 1/5 of that amount, as opposed to trying to figure out what past days they have and then pay 1/7 for even days that they weren't supposed to be working. But it's not something that's specifically provided for under the Act saying, here's how this is handled. So that's really a policy decision to be made by the particular employer. As I indicated before, and as part of the slide, this also includes any raises. So if you have somebody that's been out of work for a significant period of time on full salary benefits, and they have a new contract that is passed, and they get an increase in their pay rate, that once again increases the amount of benefits they're receiving under the Heart and Lung Act. Salary does not equal full pay. So sometimes somebody will say, well, hey, wait a second, I'll just be getting my full salary. Why was I making $1,600 a week before? Now I'm only down to $1,200, because it's not your full pay, it's what your salary is. This excludes special fringe benefits that could increase pay. One municipality tried to get smart in the past, said, well, we want to keep the injured employee the same benefit rate that they were receiving prior to their injury. So since these benefits aren't taxable, we should just pay the net amount. And the court said, no, that's not what we're going to allow here. It has to be the gross pay. So like once again, it's 40 times whatever the wage rate is. And you only use the base salary and not overtime. And this will be also another source of complaints you'll see from the injured worker. They may say, I was working a lot in the past and had all this overtime. Why am I not getting paid that? And that's, the case law is clear on that, that overtime's excluded. As I discussed here, average weekly wage, I'm not sure how many of you have familiarity with workers' comp, but you go back and you look at the 4 quarters or the year preceding the work injury, and you apply a specific formula. And that formula includes vacation time, it includes like holidays where somebody's paid time and a half or double time and a half. All that goes into an average weekly wage calculation. That does not go into the full salary calculation in terms of what benefits payable under the Heart and Lung Act. The courts have been very specific, saying that the Heart and Lung Act need not be construed to pay the exact same compensation benefits and formula as the Workers' Compensation Act. However, you still need to have your third-party administrator or insurer calculate an average weekly wage, as we'll discuss later, because heart and lung benefits are not paid in lieu of workers' compensation. It's actually a concurrent benefit. So the injured workers are entitled to benefits under both acts simultaneously, and we'll talk a little bit later about how that actually works. This is just the general quote from the case, and you'll see in the printout, I have numbers there. They relate to the citations in the back of the printout if you want to ever look up any of these particular cases. But this is the case law talking about how salary is different from the general word pay. This is the case law that deals with gross pay versus net pay. Now, what's interesting is whenever you have heart and lung benefits and you have this person receiving their full rate of pay, it's tax-free, just like workers' compensation benefits are tax-free. So what you could have is, we were talking before about how tough it is to get somebody back to work. It's even more difficult, presumably, in situations like this where a person that wasn't working overtime was just getting their regular wage with less taxes, now is sitting at home and receiving their full pay, which is greater than what they were making beforehand. It's not everybody that receives more than they were whenever they're working, but that does for some, so that may provide an incentive for some people to not return back to work as quickly as they possibly can. So that's something we try to use in litigation if that's in fact the case, if it actually goes that far into litigation. This is the fringe benefits. Once again, we don't take into account vacation days or holidays worked when we're figuring out the full salary pay. So if a holiday would happen to fall in this biweekly pay period, the injured worker doesn't receive more. It's, once again, it's just the full rate of salary. Once again, here's the case law that talks about the base pay only and not including any of the overtime wages. Like I said, this is one of the big sources of contention that you'll see whenever the injured worker contacts the adjuster or the employer and wants to say, I'm not receiving what I used to, and they just need to be made aware that, like, unfortunately, that is the way the law reads. So the second potential benefit that's receivable under the Heart and Lung Act is medical benefits. Just like under workers' comp, the Heart and Lung Benefits does provide for medical. Critical language of the statute with regards to the medical benefits says, all medical and hospital bills incurred in connection with such an injury shall be paid. You heard earlier that with regards to workers' compensation, you needed the treatment to be reasonable, necessary, and causally related. There's no such requirements with regards to heart and lung. I think you could read into it causally related. Obviously, if the injury's to a back and they start treating for a knee condition, I don't think you have to pay for that under the Heart and Lung Act. But the reasonableness and necessity issue is something that's not part of the Heart and Lung Act. So you could have situations where an insurance company, if you're insured, wants to challenge some treatment that maybe it's experimental or new, and they want to file a utilization review and say this treatment's not reasonable, necessary. Well, if they're successful, they may have to pay for that under the Workers' Compensation Act, but I believe under this provision of the Heart and Lung Act, payment still has to be made for that treatment. And the problem is now maybe you have to pay it 100% because you've lost the benefit of the repricing mechanism that's allowed for under the Workers' Compensation Act. So with my clients, I try to advise while the heart and lung benefits are being paid, it may not be advisable to actually pursue a utilization review. Other considerations, as we talked about, repricing. So under workers' compensation, you're allowed to reprice bills if any of you have experience with workers' compensation. You're only paying 113% of the Medicare rate typically. If you pay the bills under workers' compensation, it's my opinion that you've met this obligation saying all medical bills and hospital bills incurred with an injury shall be paid. Once again, this statute was created for the benefit of the municipalities, not for doctors or insurance companies. So I don't think the medical provider should come back and say, hey, I still want 100% of my bill paid. This is a heart and lung claim. I think if it's paid under workers' compensation, you've met your obligations under the Heart and Lung Act. Now, we talked earlier about panel treatment. Once again, for heart and lung, no such requirement. So presumably if an injury occurs and the injured worker treats off panel, it could be once again denied under workers' compensation saying, we're only required to pay for panel treatment during the initial 90 days. But if that's the position taken, are these bills in fact still payable under the Heart and Lung Act? I think that argument does exist. And once again, if it's payable only under heart and lung and there's no repricing mechanism under heart and lung, you could be causing yourself more liability than you otherwise would if you just paid the bills under workers' compensation, even if there wasn't panel treatment. One of the things that my clients have done whenever they agree to arbitration, they've written in provisions in their collective bargaining agreements that actually require treatment on panel, just like under the Workers' Compensation Act. We'll talk later about the benefits of agreeing to arbitration versus proceeding under local agency law. And that is one of the benefits. You could contractually agree to something like that in terms of panel compliance. The other thing, if you don't have arbitration agreements with specific provisions providing for panel treatment, the only other thing you could do to try to force panel compliance treatment is potentially just make the insinuation if the person's going to treat off panel, it's more likely the case may be denied, and then that person may be more willing to treat on panel to begin with. I don't think you just want to have a blanket policy that says if people treat off panel, we're going to deny the claims, but I think that is a red flag sometimes if the person's running off originally to a doctor of their own choosing as opposed to agreeing to proceed with panel treatment, which is the requirements under the Workers' Compensation Act. The last little item I thought to provide here is there's no provisions providing for waiver of a lien. Under workers' compensation, if you go to litigation on a denied claim and private health care paid all the bills originally, if they don't bring that lien throughout the course of that litigation, there's an argument that it's waived for purposes of workers' compensation. There is no such provision for heart and lung, so presumably they can still bring that subrogation claim under the Heart and Lung Act. So now we talked about the benefits that are payable under the Heart and Lung Act. We need to talk a little bit about what does it mean to be actually injured in the performance of one's job duties. The Workers' Compensation Act, as I talked before, this act, the Heart and Lung Act, isn't necessarily created for the benefit of the injured workers, but created for the benefit of the municipality. The Workers' Compensation Act is created for the benefit of the injured worker. So there's case law that actually provides that it's a humanitarian act that's construed liberally to the benefit of the injured worker to promote its humanitarian purposes. If you ever see that, you're about to lose a case. With regards to heart and lung, the event actually needs an official police response. The Workers' Compensation Act doesn't have that specific requirement. It allows for recoveries arising in the course of one's employment and related thereto, as was discussed earlier. So what's the difference actually between these standards of in the course of employment and performance of job duties? I'll give you an example because the Heart and Lung Act is actually narrower. You could have a case that's compensable under the Workers' Compensation Act, but not compensable under the Heart and Lung Act. At the bottom there, I provide one of my cases, which is the LaPaglia versus City of Pittsburgh example. He was a SWAT officer doing a stakeout, and they were told to go home, get a couple hours of sleep, and meet at a different location the next day. So on his way to the new location, a drunk driver crossed the road and struck his vehicle, causing him injuries. This was something that was litigated first by the claimant in the Workers' Compensation Forum, where it's found that he was directed to go to this new location, so he was on a special mission. It wasn't governed by the coming and going rule because of a special mission, so it was compensable under workers' comp. Now, with regards to the full salary component, performance of job duties, he was still driving to the place where he was supposed to go to start his job. So he wasn't yet doing his job duties. So in reality, this is a case that should be compensable only in workers' comp, not in the full salary form. But given the way things played out with the arbitrator and the subsequent appeal, he was actually awarded benefits under both, even though it was incorrect, as the judge in the Court of Common Pleas indicated. So what does it mean to be injured in the performance of the job duties? The officer must be injured as a result of an event which triggers an official police response, is the way that the law has come down. Another way to look at this standard is the injured worker performing an obligatory task, conduct, service, or function arising from his or her position. Now, this may date me, but this is not the Buford T. Justice standard. They don't need to be in hot pursuit to have a heart and lung claim. It could be a minor obligatory task, and I give the one example. The officer is walking back to his car after having lunch. Doesn't seem like he's really doing anything that requires an official police response, but the court reasoned that he had to get back into his vehicle to start his shift again once he deviated from the shift to go have lunch. So that was found to be compensable under a heart and lung claim. One thing I want to point out is it's tough to sit here and say here's what is and what isn't compensable, because a lot of these cases are fact sensitive and decided on a case-by-case basis. And you have to also realize when dealing with first responders, they're looked at more favorably by most workers' compensation judges, by arbitrators, and even by hearing officers if we go the hearing officer route. So what I did is I provided a few examples of cases to get into the course of, or the performance of job duty standard. And where you typically see cases fought is when the person is beginning a shift or not necessarily doing things related to their employment. Preparing for the shift, they're on the employer's premises, they're getting ready for their shift, getting dressed, hurts his hand, cuts his hand on a towel dispenser. So once again, that could be compensable under workers' compensation because he's in the the course of employment, if you're there at a reasonable time before your shift, but he's not yet in the performance of his job duty. So you could have liability solely under workers' comp, not under heart and lung. Same thing, slipping on stairs before shift, before you're actually starting your position. The other thing that the case law had for denials is personal tasks. And it seems like these two cases where they went out before their shift ended to go warm up their car and then slipped on ice and fell and got hurt. Once again, that could be compensable under workers' compensation. That could be denied under workers' compensation too. That's once again a case-specific, fact-sensitive matter. But under heart and lung, those were not compensable injuries. Other denied cases, practicing with a service weapon. You're off duty. Even though you're getting ready for a weapons qualification, that was not found to be compensable under the Heart and Lung Act as being in the performance of the job duties. One that was a little bit surprising was there was an overnight stakeout, and the officer was going to eat dinner while on this stakeout and contracted hepatitis A, and they didn't find that to be compensable as being in the performance of one's job's duties. Another officer was on administrative leave and was driving to a grievance type of meeting, and they said that wasn't requiring an official police function for him to have to go to this separate meeting from his employment. So that was also found not compensable. And then the other example was a double back shift, which was for the Pennsylvania State Police, where they'd go home, have lunch, and come back for the second part of the shift. He was in an unmarked car, and while driving back to work, was injured in a motor vehicle accident. Once again, not found to be in the course or performance of job duties. The other big one that you'll see, now this is once again a thing that could be compensable under workers' compensation, not compensable under the Heart and Lung Act, is the consequential condition. The case that came up with this holding was an injured officer who was at home walking up the stairs, and he bent over to grab his injured knee, which was the work injury, which happened in the performance of his job duties. And when bending over to grab his knee, he hurt his back. This could be, once again, be something compensable under workers' comp, not compensable as a heart and lung claim, because that second condition, when he hurt his back, was not something that occurred in the course of employment. So you could have a situation where liability under workers' comp is for both components of the injury. The Heart and Lung Act is only for the knee. Once he's recovered from the knee, you're able to work because of the knee. he may lose the entitlement to receive the full salary benefits under the Heart and Lung Act, but still be entitled to receive wage loss and medical treatment under the Workers' Compensation Act for the other component, which is the low back condition. Now, once again, as I told you before, a lot of cases are fact dependent, so you change the facts a little bit, the law changes. So just because you're off duty and you get injured doesn't necessarily mean it's not compensable under the Heart and Lung Act. Here's a case where an officer, there's a lot of burglaries in his neighborhood. He sees a suspicious vehicle on his property, goes to investigate it, identifies himself as being a police officer, reaches inside the truck speeds away, he injures his arm. Because he identified himself as a police officer, he was in the performance of his job duties at that time. That was found to be compensable under the Heart and Lung Act. And I actually had a similar circumstance recently. A City of Pittsburgh police officer off duty to block party. Neighbors got rowdy, went over to investigate, identified himself as a police officer, was shot and killed. So once again, yeah, just because you're off duty doesn't necessarily mean that you start to engage in activity which is related to your official capacity as a police officer, you could still be in the performance of your job duties. These heart and lung claims could also involve mental conditions. Now, if there is a mental condition, until the law changes, with regard to post-traumatic stress, you still have, they read into it the workers' comp requirements, so you need an abnormal work condition for a pure mental claim to be compensable. The one case, there was mental disability when the officer became the target of an internal affairs investigation based upon an investigation of a murder. That seems a little off to me that this is something that's outside what he's doing, but since it arose from his official police duties, they found that to be compensable. So after you now have, your employee is entitled to heart and lung benefits, he was injured in the performance of his job duties, the next thing you need to look at when you're assessing whether there's liability under the Heart and Lung Act is, did the individual have a temporary incapacity? And the critical language from the statute is if temporarily incapacitated from performing the job duties, they shall be paid until the disability arising therefrom has ceased. So now we have two special terms of art to look at. Under workers' comp, if any of you have familiarity with workers' compensation, we all know that disability means loss of wages. And the courts have said that under the Heart and Lung Act, they believe the word disability has the same meaning as in workers' comp. Once again, they read the Heart and Lung Act and the Workers' Compensation Act in pari materia. So basically the Workers' Compensation Act supplements the Heart and Lung Act where there's any need to fill in special provisions. Now, incapacity is not something that workers' compensation judges deal with, or it's even in the Workers' Compensation Act. It doesn't mean not able to perform job duties of a position, but it's not able to do the job duties of a position that's regularly assigned to employees. And there is a slight little difference there, which we'll get into a little bit. So you don't need to perform every conceivable function of your job, because a lot of times, an officer could say, look, I could do the general walking the beat, I could drive the vehicle around, but it's if I get in that situation where I have to chase down a suspect, I just can't do that aspect of my job. When here's the one case they're talking about, the alternative positions, is a state trooper case, and where we get into jobs assigned typically to officers. So after he was injured as a regular trooper, he was then put into truck detail, where you see those weigh stations on the side of the road. So he was there taking care of the truckers and then doing warrants and weights. But eventually he said that was too difficult because sometimes that resulted in confrontations with the truckers themselves. So the courts looked at it too and said, well, wait a second, he was also able to do a lesser duty job that was typically assigned to the state troopers, which was the identification division, which is CSI. So just because he couldn't do his job as a full-time trooper didn't mean that he was temporarily incapacitated, because he could do this job in the CSI division of the state troopers. One thing you need to also look at is you can have a permanent injury, but it not be a permanent disability. And once again, we get into those situations, as we talked about earlier, where you might lose a part of a finger or a part of a toe. So you have a permanent injury with regards to the loss of the appendage. but that doesn't mean that you're permanently incapacitated because you can still do your full duty job. So just because you see a permanent injury, you can't just equate that to being a permanent incapacity to deny heart and lung benefits. So the question that I typically get is, well, how long is a temporary incapacity? And I give you the quote there. I'm not going to read the whole quote from the case that I cite to there. And one of the things that I bring up, you'll see whenever I use the word permanent / no longer temporary, we typically try to speak in terms, whenever I handle these heart and lung cases, of the incapacity being no longer temporary as opposed to permanent. We'll get into res judicata effect. Does the decision in the heart and lung forum have any binding effect in the workers' compensation forum? But it typically doesn't. But you still want to try to avoid situations where you're having a decision where it says something is permanent, because you never know if later on you'd be litigating a petition in the workers' compensation forum, a full recovery, and the other side's going to come in waiving a heart and lung decision saying, how can they say he's recovered before they argued he was permanent? So it's a slight difference, technical difference there in terms of no longer temporary versus permanent, but we try to use that language for that purpose. Once again, we need to consider everything's fact specific. You need to understand that it's typically the employer's burden of proof in these heart and lung cases. So a person's on benefits, receiving this full salary benefits, and you get a medical report from either his doctor or an IME physician saying that the claimant's no longer temporarily incapacitated. Other language that you'll typically see is the incapacities of an unknown or indefinite duration. So if you have that language, that's enough to move forward with your heart and lung litigation, trying to terminate heart and lung benefits on the basis of permanence or no longer temporarily incapacitated. But it's up to the employer to produce by substantial evidence a reasonable inference that the claimant's disability is of a lasting or indefinite duration. Now there's one case out there, it's an outlier, the Gelati case, where the claimant filed a reinstatement petition after he was back to work. Now he only came back to work for less than a week, but during that period of time he was back to work for less than a week, full duty, his heart and lung benefits were voluntarily stopped, and then he filed the reinstate benefits, and the court said on that reinstatement petition there was no evidence submitted whatsoever that his incapacity was only temporary. So the court said we can't reinstate benefits on him because we're not sure, there's been no evidence submitted that says this is a temporary incapacity. So they sort of implied that the burden of proof was on the claimant, although they said in the decision that they're not making that finding, the burden specifically on the claimant. One of the questions I have is that should that be the same burden on a claim petition, just like workers' comp? Look at the petition and it changes the burden. But typically we don't necessarily deny heart and lung claims just off the bat, saying, hey, officer or firefighter, prove to us that your incapacity is only temporary. We usually accept it first and put the burden on the employer to come prove differently. There's a difference between what you can do legally, and we can make those arguments legally, versus what you want to do practically. You don't want to necessarily treat your employees that way and say, we're going to deny all your cases because you can't prove to us when you're coming back to work. So let's talk about that period to consider. How long does it take? I've actually had some attorneys call me and say, well, I've heard that once a year passes, the benefits end. As I indicated, that's something like for EMS. I know my clients have negotiated that into their contracts, but that's not really heart and lung. There's no specific requirement under heart and lung that after a year, somebody's considered no longer temporarily incapacitated. There's two cases that I found that I cite to there. They're under 43 and 44. They were about 595 days when the decision was rendered, and that was about 4 months after it started. The other one's about 554 days. So you're looking about the initiation of litigation on both those cases about a year and a half out. So what I typically tell my clients is look at about a year out to a year and 2 or 3 months out, and then try to look forward to either writing to the claimant's doctor to get an opinion on if the injury is permanent or no longer temporary, and also set up an IME at that time. And then by the time you get back your reports, you're about a year and a half out, and if the injured worker still hasn't been able to return back to work, it may be at that point in time when you want to start initiating litigation in the heart and lung forum to stop the full salary benefits. And once again, as I talked about before, about what you can do legally versus what you can, what you should do. I'll give an example. We have had officers, for the clients I've represented, who have been shot in the line of duty, became paraplegics. Once again, probably never ever returning back to work in a full duty capacity. So right away, you could have probably said, look, this is a temporary, but while you could do that legally, that's not the decision that was made, basically morally, or how to treat the injured officer. So full salary benefits was paid, and even though opinions were obtained throughout that it was permanent, never returning back to full duty work, benefits kept on continuing until eventually the employer said, okay, now it's time to move forward and we need to stop this. And one of the things you'll see too, and sometimes that situation, the cessation of full salary benefits may actually be more beneficial to the injured worker. When you're talking about them changing from full salary down to workers' comp, they also at that time are probably putting in for a disability pension. So if you look at the disability pension coupled with workers' comp, which will be reduced by the pension offset, they could still be in a better financial situation receiving their pension and reduced workers' comp than they were receiving full salary benefits. One of the things you also need to consider with regards to litigation for the full salary cases is having medical evidence. Like I said, just the passage of time is not going to be sufficient. You can't just say, hey, it's been like 1.5 years, this isn't temporary anymore. That's not going to carry the day. So you need to get either an IME or an opinion from the claimant's doctor, and basically they need to discuss nature of condition, treatment history, general health, current medical status, and the duration of disability and other relevant factors to prove that inference that the condition is not going to improve sufficiently to return to active work. Now, I've actually had one case where the individual had a surgery 1 year out, had a surgery 2 years out. Client got an opinion saying, hey, look, this is no longer temporary, it's an unknown indefinite duration, had a surgery right after that, so they didn't proceed with litigation. So now we're 3 years out, they once again get an opinion saying, not temporary anymore, it's permanent, never going back to work, or at least it's an unknown duration, we're not sure if you'll ever return to work. Initiate the litigation, claimant says, hey, look, I'm going to try for one more surgery. It's the fourth one. We're now 4 years out. And eventually, what did he do? He returns back to work. So the arbitrator in that case indicated, look, this still wasn't temporary, or this still was temporary capacity all along, even though that individual was out of work for more than 4 years. On the other side of the coin is you could have that person that's out for 1.5 years, and they're found to be no longer temporary based upon the medical evidence. So once again, everything's fact-specific. So you can't just say, here's the ones that will be temporary, here's the ones that won't be. Now, as I talked before, while you have this obligation under the Heart and Lung Act, you also have the concurrent obligation under workers' compensation. You don't get workers or heart and lung benefits in lieu of workers' comp. I've seen that language a lot of times from a lot of different carriers that say, well, we don't have to do anything under workers' comp, we've just paid heart and lung all along. The fact that some of my clients actually handled it that way and didn't issue workers' compensation bureau documents, and then we got involved and told them that was wrong. Meanwhile, they're fighting penalty petition after penalty petition saying they violated their obligations under the Workers' Compensation Act to not accept or deny a case within 21 days. So different practice pointers you'll see that I've outlined here. You still should have either your third-party administrator or insurance carrier issue bureau documents in a timely fashion, meet all other obligations under the Workers' Compensation Act. Failure to meet those obligations can result in penalty petitions in the workers' compensation forum. Now, how you handle heart and lung benefits, there's no specific guidance out there. It's like I said, it's a 2-page statute. It's not as detailed as workers' comp. I've had clients that have actually, like I said, in a collective bargaining agreement provided for their own bureau documents, their own notice of heart and lung benefits. But you don't have to do something like that. If you don't, what you could do is you could work in connection with your carrier or third-party administrator and actually just note the liability under the Heart and Lung Act on the bureau documents being issued. It's a little bit tougher now with WICAS and the new bureau documents. Before, you had that nice little section, remarks. You could put extra comments in there. Now it's limited in terms of the number of characters you could put in, but you can still do that. Say, in addition to liability under workers' comp, there's liability under the Heart and Lung Act. Now, the case law says that if you have a self-insured employer, which a lot of my clients are, they need not actually make the payment under workers' comp. You just need to make the full salary payment. It doesn't make sense administratively to have the same employer who's self-insured cut the workers' comp check and then cut the full salary check and then tell the claimant, okay, now return to us the payment we made to you for workers' comp. That's just an administrative hassle. So you could just issue the bureau document, but not actually issue the workers' compensation payment. As I talked before, I think you could still do repricing once you acknowledge the case under workers' compensation. And as I talked before about the courts looked at the Workers' Comp Act to fill in gaps with the Heart and Lung Act, reading things in peri materia. And the one case I cite to here talked about the admissibility of hearsay evidence as a closed period case, so hearsay was still admissible under workers' comp, so they said should also be admissible under the Heart and Lung Act. So as I talked before about having the concurrent obligations and issuing the 2 checks and having the claimant pay the check back, the officer actually is entitled to receive benefits under both acts. So if you have an insurance carrier, the insurance carrier would technically be required to pay the claimant the workers' comp amount. The municipality is responsible to pay the full salary amount, and then the claimant has to pay back the employer the workers' comp amount for any period of time that they receive the full salary benefit. That's how it typically works. Now, rather than have that extra step of paying the claimant and having the claimant pay the municipality, a lot of times you'll see the insurance carrier just issue a check directly to the municipality, or have the claimant endorse the check to send it to the municipality and have the claimant endorse the check there whenever they pick up their full salary check. Now, where it gets interesting is sometimes this could actually result in an inequity where the municipality is receiving more in terms of what the claimant's to get under workers' comp than the claimant's actually entitled to under the Heart and Lung Act. You may see this where the claimant works a lot of overtime, or in situations where the claimant has a concurrent employment. They have a second job. So that I gave you an example there where the job with the municipality is 20 hours, $20 an hour, and then there's 10 hours of overtime at an hour and a half. They also works 10 hours a week as concurrent employment. So under workers' comp, the individual will be entitled to $933 a week, but your heart and lung rate is still set at that full salary amount, which is the workers' comp, the 40 times the wage rate. So the municipality pays the claimant that $800 a week, and then they turn around and get from the insurance carrier $933 a week. So they're actually getting paid more because of the injury to the employee. And the court said, we understand this is an inequity, but unfortunately, that's what the language of the Heart and Lung Statute says. It says for any period of time that the claimant receives the full salary benefits, he has to pay back the workers' comp that he receives or is payable. If the claimant doesn't pay that back, it's not a criminal action, it's just a civil action, so the employer may have to pursue that separately. So the question I have is, are workers' compensation benefits actually payable if the claimant's getting his full salary, and it says in there that you don't need to necessarily pay the claimant in those situations if you're self-insured? And the courts addressed that in the Tyson versus City of Chester case, where an insurance carrier said, look, the claimant's already been paid full salary benefits. We shouldn't have to pay the workers' comp. There's no actual loss of wages now because he's already been fully compensated. And the court said, no, when there's liability under both acts, the ultimate obligations under the Workers' Compensation Act, so that carrier was still required to pay benefits in that matter. Now, there's 2 recent cases that sort of cast a little bit of doubt, at least in my mind, on this, and they both dealt with subrogation. And one was actually my case with the self-insured, the Commonwealth. And the courts have found that there's no right to subrogation for any benefits paid under the Heart and Lung Act if there's a motor vehicle accident and the claimant tries to recover against a negligent third party. I had cases where it was a trucker and it was $1 million or $1.2 million third-party recovery, and since we only paid heart and lung benefits, the courts found that we were not entitled to subrogation. There's clearly subrogation under workers' comp under Section 319, but the courts said under the Motor Vehicle Financial Responsibilities Law, there was no subrogation for the heart and lung benefits, and that's all that was paid. Where it gets a little bit more tricky is the more recent case where it was an insured employer. The insurance carrier was making that payment to the employer, but they were making payments under the Workers' Compensation Act that they're required to make. And even though it was workers' comp payments they were making, they still found there's no right to subrogation. I think this is purely a political decision by the courts. They just wanted to ensure that the injured officers were receiving the full amount of the third-party recoveries and weren't having them reduced by a subrogation claim. But it sort of makes you think, if there's no right to subrogation for compensation that's payable under the Workers' Compensation Act, why is there compensation payable under the Workers' Compensation Act? So I think it opens up the door to arguments, but nobody's gone there yet with making those arguments. So here's another unique situation. You'll talk a little bit later how it impacts how you decide where to litigate a case. But you could actually create additional liability for your client because of attorney's fees payable under workers' compensation. The courts don't look at it as the claimant receiving the benefits that are payable to the attorney. So I try to use an example, the same numbers I used before. So if you get an opinion of full recovery and you decide to litigate it first in the workers' compensation forum, typically 99.8% of cases the judge denies your request for supersedious and awards deduction of 20% attorney's fees payable to claimant's counsel. So in that situation, now the claimant only receives 80% of the workers' comp benefits, and then he's returning that 80% of the workers' comp benefit back to the municipality. The 20% payable to his attorney still gets paid to the attorney, and all the while this does not reduce the obligation under the Heart and Lung Act to pay the claimant the full salary benefit. So in the situation where we had where the employer was getting $933 a week whenever they're only paying out $800, now because of the 20% going to counsel, they're receiving back less, $746.66. And where this is interesting is if you're a self-insured employer, now you're still paying the claimant that full salary benefit, but you also have that obligation to pay that 20% of the workers' comp above and beyond the full salary amount. So by litigating the case first in the full salary form, you just create yourself additional liability, which doesn't make sense to me. But unfortunately, there's actually two cases that have come out that way. So that is the status of the current law on that issue. I'm just going to gloss over potential estoppel. One of the things Barb indicated before is you start paying workers' comp, then you've picked up the claim if you didn't recognize the injury. That's the way it is under the workers' comp forum. Given collateral estoppel effect, they're not going to necessarily hold that to you whenever you pick it up. The municipality picks it up under the Heart and Lung Act. If an individual misses a day or two here or there and you pay the full salary benefits, if later it's investigated by the insurance carrier that this was not a compensable claim, just because they received the full salary benefits, most likely it's not going to come back to bind the insurance carrier in the workers' compensation forum. This is just the case law that discusses the general factors leading to collateral estoppel. And one thing when talking about collateral estoppel from the Heart and Lung forum to the workers' compensation forum, they typically say there's not identity of issues, which is the first issue, saying is the prior adjudication identical to the one in the later action. And the reason why they say there's not identity of issues is they say there's not the same amount in dispute. They actually say that there's less in dispute in the full salary case because that's a temporary benefit, whereas workers' compensation benefits can be a lifetime benefit. So they say that you don't have as much at stake in the full salary case, and they're not going to bind you if you don't fully prevail in the forum. Some of the cases also talk about there's more procedural safeguards in workers' comp. It's more formal, so they don't want the less formal proceeding to be binding in the more formal proceeding. Now, there's a couple cases you'll see I've cited too, though, that say going the other way, that a decision by a workers' compensation judge may have collateral estoppel effect in heart and lung litigation. So this is something to consider whenever you want to decide where you're first going to litigate a case. Do you want to go first in the heart and lung forum or into the workers' comp forum? I'll talk a little bit later about drawbacks, but as I talked before, you go into workers' comp first, you may be creating this additional liability, but you may actually then have a decision that you could use in the heart and lung forum, whereas if you go to the heart and lung forum first, you may not have that same collateral estoppel effect. So other things you need to consider when talking about the concurrent benefits payable under heart and lung and workers' comp. Don't argue the same thing in the contrary positions at the same time. That doesn't work. So we had a situation where the right hand didn't know what the left hand was doing. You had the municipality saying this person's condition was permanent, no longer temporary. Then you had the insurance carrier saying, oh, they're fully recovered. So you can't do that at the same time. You could do that, like I said, if a little bit of time passes, but you can't do that at the same time or they're going to find you're not able to proceed in that fashion. The other thing you can't do is vocational rehabilitation if the person's receiving heart and lung benefits. That's most likely in line with the union cases that you can't proceed with vocational rehabilitation if somebody would lose a qualitative benefit, but it's something where the courts have specifically found The individual receiving heart and lung benefits is not required to even participate with the vocational rehabilitation. So now we talked about who's entitled to benefits. They're now receiving benefits. Question is, how then do you address the full salary dispute? Whether you're trying to say that the individual should no longer be receiving benefits or they think they're entitled to them and you've denied the claim. And there's due process concerns, especially in the context where they're receiving the benefit. You can't just stop the benefit that's a property right that they have without giving them an opportunity to be heard. One case up there, they gave the claimant 4 days notice. Said, we're doing a hearing at the next meeting, and we're going to talk about whether you still get benefits or not. Wasn't sufficient. And if you don't follow the procedures and give them sufficient notice to appear and defend and litigate the issue, they could be awarded the retroactive full salary benefits back. So there's a couple situations we talked about before where a due process hearing is not required. Once again, the voluntary retirement. So if the person voluntarily retires, they're no longer a member of that class of employees entitled to benefits. Those benefits can stop unilaterally. That's one of the things we'll typically see when we settle a case. We'll get a resignation, and that resignation ends the full salary benefits. There's also involuntary retirement. The example I give you was one where the municipality passed an ordinance requiring the retirement of the 2 oldest officers, one of which was the injured worker. And since even it wasn't a voluntary retirement, it was involuntary, he once again was not a member of the class of employees entitled to such benefits, so the heart and lung benefits stopped. The last is termination due to conduct unbecoming, or some other reason not related to the injury. One of the big questions I get to, and it's unsettled, and it's really a matter of policy concern. How do you handle a situation where the injured worker comes back to work in a part-time capacity? So they previously were full-time, now they come back maybe 10 hours a week to start, moving up to 20 hours a week, moving to 30 hours a week. You could have the situation where they get paid the difference. So if they're working 10 hours a week, do they get paid 30 hours of full salary? Or do you plug that formula into the workers' compensation Act and look at their average weekly wage less current earnings and then pay 2/3 the difference? It actually could change, whereas if you do it under heart and lung, you may pay more whenever they're at 10 hours a week versus 30 hours a week, so they could get more in workers' comp. Just be consistent in how you apply that across the board. You can't just say we're going to pick and choose, so if you're back to work 10 hours a week, we're going to pay you the full salary, but whenever you're back to work 30 hours a week, we're going to pay you the partial under workers' comp. It's not going to work that way if you're cherry picking to your benefit. I think you just want to be consistent and apply that. Like I said, there's no specific guidance under the Heart and Lung Act or any of the case law that I've researched. So now we get to the issue of where to litigate the claim. You could essentially litigate in the workers' comp form versus the heart and lung form. Typically, because of the extra payments under heart or workers' comp, whenever the full salary benefit or the supersedis request is denied, we litigate first our cases in the heart and lung form. Downside to that, now you're paying arbitration fees if you use an arbitrator, which could get sometimes costly. They typically charge for a full day to do a hearing. If it's an hour hearing, you're going to pay for an 8-hour day of $1,200 for the day. Same with writing the decisions. Litigating first in workers' comp can be advantageous with regards to the judge decision having a binding effect in the heart and lung forum. Like I said, the drawbacks are the extra attorney's fees. Also, that litigation in workers' comp is going to require most likely deposition testimony, which once again increases your cost of litigation. Whereas sometimes, I know with my collective bargaining agreements, all medical reports are admissible in the heart and lung proceedings. You're trying to keep costs down with regards to the heart and lung proceedings. I'm going to try to jump through here pretty quickly to wrap everything up. So the other thing, the big point to talk about is you have 2 different ways to litigate outside of workers' comp. You could agree with the union, put it in a collective bargaining agreement that you're going to arbitrate those cases. There could be problems, like I said, with regards to cost there. The other way you could do it is through local agency law. So if you haven't agreed to arbitration with the union to handle your full salary disputes, you're supposed to proceed with a local agency law due process hearing. So everybody says, well, what is that? And once again, there's not much law on that, and I've cited to you what you basically need to do. The parties need to have the opportunity to be represented before the local agency. The local agency should most likely create the transcript themselves, but if they don't, you need to let the claimant create a transcript, have a court reporter there, so everything's documented if they'll do so at their expense. The other thing to do is make sure that your hearing officer is somebody that's separate from the counsel handling it. I have clients that have done both arbitration. I have some that do the local agency. I've done local agency hearings where I've been the litigator, and they have an assistant county solicitor be the hearing officer. So in those situations, you think that you'd have a more favorable tribunal, at least writing the decision, if a solicitor for the county is writing the decision as opposed to an arbitrator. A lot of times arbitrators are a little bit more pro-claimant, a little bit more pro-employee. I know I've talked to claimant's counsel. It's had situations where the person acting as the hearing officer has actually been in correspondence with the attorney handling the litigation. And he brought up conflicts in that situation to try to get the adjudication thrown out. I've actually been appointed by a couple local municipalities in the Pittsburgh area to be their hearing officer. So in those cases, they would most likely proceed with the solicitor for the municipality being the one that presents the case, and then having an outside attorney that's appointed by resolution or ordinance be the one that acts as their hearing officer. One of the differences you also see, and this is where it gets unique too, is there's a difference in terms of appellate rights. Whenever you have an arbitration, you have very limited appellate rights. I talked before about my case, LaPaglia, where the arbitrator essentially said because he was in the course of employment under the workers' compensation judge's decision, he's also in the performance of his job duties. We appealed that to the Court of Common Pleas. The judge agreed with us there in front of the Court of Common Pleas that this was the wrong standard burden of proof to be applied. But he said because you went through arbitration, it's binding arbitration, you're stuck with it, except for 4 minor exceptions, which I discussed, and they're called the narrow certiorari scope of review. Essentially, it needs to be a deprivation of a constitutional issue, irregularity of proceedings, or 2 minor other exceptions. With regards to mistakes of law, or applying the wrong law, or mistakes of fact, that's not something that the appellate courts could look at. So how does heart and lung typically play out? As I indicated, we get the opinion of recovery or no longer temporary. We bring the petition. If it's the claimant's own doctor, a lot of times they won't contest it. A lot of times you'll see them then put in for a disability pension. So now you go from paying out full salary, which is the municipality's obligation, to just paying out workers' comp, which is paid out by the insurance carrier. But then that workers' comp amount is also further reduced because of a pension offset to the extent the employer contributes to the pension. That's a whole other issue, how to litigate pension offset cases. That's a full seminar that's incredibly boring. You're talking about actuary testimony, which takes several hours to explain the process. I'm not going to go through all the different scenarios, but the take-home points that I think you need to discuss if you have potential heart and lung liability is there's not a lot of guidance. Like I said, the Act's not very specific, so there's a lot of ways you could handle it. You should obtain counsel, not necessarily with legal counsel, but with those insurance carrier, TPA, broker, who understand heart and lung benefits and help guide you through the process. Determine how you want to handle the situation. Like I said, if you're going to go through arbitration, you're going to have to most likely negotiate it with the union, what you want in your collective bargaining agreement. Do you want this to proceed under local agency law? One thing you need to do is definitely coordinate. Like I said, you don't want to do situations where right hand and left hand don't understand what each other are doing, where you're presenting contrary opinions in the heart and lung forum and the workers' compensation forum, having your carrier or TPA file for utilization review, which increases costs while it's not going to create any benefit in terms of denying the treatment. You're still going to pay for it under the Heart and Lung Act. So make sure that you definitely coordinate with individuals that you're working with regards to heart and lung benefits. And whenever you have any questions or concerns, like I said, make sure you consult with the individuals you associate with that have more knowledge of workers' comp and heart and lung issues. Once again, if anybody has any questions, feel free to contact me. Hopefully, find this informative.
Barb and Robert talked about a lot of the things that I had prepared, and we didn't connect up beforehand. So there's a lot of things that will come together here to bring this all together. Next slide, please. Can everyone hear me? Okay, good. So I'm just going to talk about municipalities and OSHA. I work for AmTrust, and we insure about 1,500 municipalities between Pennsylvania, New Jersey, and Delaware. So, and I see them all because that's my territory. And I get these questions a lot when I make the recommendations, and we get into conversations about that. Best practice, I'll just talk about a few best practices and share with you some resources. So after this is all said and done, and you go back to your day job. Now what do? We got all this information we got here today. What do? Where do we go when we need help? Because I'm going to assume that we're not going to all be able to take this information and just run with it. We're going to probably need a little bit of hand-holding. So I'll give you some resources and involve any questions. Next. Do I have the clicker? I have the power. Okay. All right, so municipalities are not covered under the OSHA Act. But there are some examples where you are covered under the OSHA Act. For example, the last bullet point, if you're a controlling entity and you have subcontractors, almost every municipality has a subcontractor. Those subcontractors are covered under OSHA. And you can be cited as a municipality as a controlling entity. Why should you adopt the OSHA guidelines? Because I'm sure your loss control people have come into your organization and tell you need to have all these programs, right? You need to have a hazard communication program and safe lifting programs and PPE and all of that stuff. Some of those things you might already have and others you don't. Well, OSHA is just a minimum standard, a basic minimum standard. So, and it's adopted by industry. So there's a lot of companies out there, private industry, that go far over and above OSHA. Municipalities, what we're asking you to do minimally is abide by the OSHA regulations. And why? Because you can be, for example, if someone is killed, God forbid, but someone's killed within your organization, their surviving spouse can then sue the municipality. So, and what are the lawyers going to do when they go to sue the municipality? They're going to say, where are your formal programs? Do you have safety training? Do you have orientation? Did you take my 25-year-old husband and put him on a piece of machinery that he had no idea how to operate? So that would help in your plight to protect your municipality by having some of these programs together. And several of these other things here, reducing losses, increasing productivity, lowers overtime costs, and reduction in work comp premium, that was covered extensively previously. So I won't go over those. Next. Oh, let me try it. There we go. Best practices. So here are some of the things with all of the municipalities that I see. Who here is an AmTrust insured? Anyone? Aha, we'll have to meet. Because we haven't as of yet. I just started with AmTrust 14 months ago, so I'm relatively new to the organization. So I'm not new to insurance, but I'm trying to get around to my customers and meet them. So this will be an opportunity where we can meet each other afterwards. But so these are the things that I ask for, and that some of the other carriers that I've worked for in the past have asked for. Do you have a written safety program? If you don't, get one. Because it gives you the boilerplate of kind of what you should do. And your insurance carrier will provide that for you. So, and by state statutes, if you ask your insurance carrier for help with your workers' compensation programs, they are required to give it to you by state law. At no cost to you, by the way, no matter how big or small you are. Fleet safety programs, safety committees. In the state of Pennsylvania, you have the ability to get 5% off of your workers' compensation premium indefinitely if you have a certified safety committee. There's a lot of requirements for the certified safety committee, but I'll tell you, it will help you get in line with a formal safety program, as well as it will help to increase the overall awareness within your municipality. Formal fleet safety programs. Every municipality has fleets. We have from the police cars to the guys that are checking the meters, guys and gals that are checking the meters, to zoning officials, all the way up to the heavy dump trucks that are plowing the roads. So all municipalities have vehicles, and it's very, very important because of a very strict law that talks about negligent entrustment. Has anybody ever heard the phrase negligent entrustment? Okay, so put in your mind, think about this. Do you know somebody in your family, your neighbor, your friends, that you would not trust driving your car? Everybody got that person in their head? Usually everybody has somebody like that, right? My son, my middle son, he's never driven my car, and he will never drive my car. Negligent entrustment. If you entrust somebody to drive your vehicle, you have a township, borough, municipality, county, and you allow an employee to drive your vehicle, you should have some kind of idea whether they should be driving that vehicle or not. They could be a great employee, but they have bad driving habits. And on their personal time, they have those bad driving habits. Now those driving habits become suspect to you while they're driving your vehicle. And your vehicles are typically police vehicles. They're souped up. They can go pretty fast. And those heavy trucks, when they hit stuff, fall down, go boom. Right? So very important. New employee orientation. I always ask my municipalities, so do you bring anybody in temporarily? That's the big one, where you have college students come in and work for your municipality on a temporary basis, maybe just summer help. God bless millennials. But millennials will come in. I hate painting a broad brush, but they come in, and in a couple of days they want to be the boss. They don't need training. Okay? There may be some of us that are in here that are millennials. I apologize for my broad brush. But we need to give them some training. Because what we typically do is to give them, those millennials that come in on a temporary basis, we give them the jobs that nobody else wants to do. The string trimming, where they go out and then they get poison ivy or they get stung by bees because they don't know anything about it. Right? So those are the people we got to give the training to, because they affect your workers' comp premium, which affects your mod. And the mod, your workers' comp losses are the gift that keeps on giving. Because we all know that if you don't, you will now. You get losses now, this year, they affect you for 3 years. So it don't matter, that one bad year is going to affect your mod for 3 years. So you want to try to minimize those losses. Initial and ongoing training. You don't just train somebody initially and then let them go. Because where do the accidents happen? They usually happen with the younger people, the newer people coming in because they don't know any better, and the more seasoned people that they've been there, done that, got the hat and t-shirt. Right? The ones in the middle are usually okay. And I can show you all these statistics that will prove that. So you got to keep ongoing training, reminding people. I just did Saturday morning at 7 o'clock out in Hanover, Pennsylvania. I did a training presentation to professional truckers. These guys that drive a truck for a living. Me, city guy, gonna teach these guys about driving safety. First thing I did, I told them, I love you guys. If I wanted to be on the road with anybody else, I'd rather be on the road with you guys because you know what you're doing. Everybody else is idiots. I got them on my side just that quick. But, when I try to tell them about ongoing training, and I said, my job here is not to teach you how to drive a truck. My job here is to give you some tidbits that prepare you for the other idiots out there, like me. So that's what the ongoing training is really good for. Accident investigation and root cause analysis. So we had an accident. Doug was walking through the shop on his cell phone, wasn't paying attention, and he slipped on the floor and fell, broke his elbow. So I see these accident investigation reports written up. Doug was an idiot. He shouldn't have been on his cell phone. That's easy, but that doesn't get to the root cause. And you got to challenge yourselves if you have a safety committee or you're an HR person. You got to challenge yourself to what was the root cause? Was Doug supposed to? The 5 whys Barb mentioned. Why was Doug walking through the shop? He's our accountant. Why was Doug on his cell phone? Is there a policy and procedure in place for not to be on your cell phone? And if so, was Doug communicated that? Why was the oil on the floor? Why didn't somebody clean it up? Why didn't somebody block it off? Why didn't somebody do maintenance on the vehicle that had the oil spill? So why? We can get to the root cause. So those are things that are really important. And I will challenge you to get with your insurance professional, because the police officers, they're good at this investigation stuff. You guys aren't. I'm telling you, you're not. And so how do you get better at it? You utilize your police officers to help in that cause. You get them on your safety committee, as well as you use your insurance professionals like myself. Leadership accountability. People tend to do what they're held accountable to do. If managers and supervisors don't feel like safety is part of their job, they're not going to push it. So not only holding them accountable, but maybe having a reward program or a bonus program if you go X amount of time without a lost time accident in your department. It helps incentivize them. It helps have them to have some skin in the game. And return to work, modified duty. I don't have to talk about that. But I will throw out one couple of things that people never think about as modified duty. They never think about training. Because if I get injured on the job and I can't lift, bend, twist, or turn, that doesn't stop me from sitting in front of a computer and doing training. Or maybe answering phones or doing something philanthropic that the township or municipality is they're associated with. Let's just say Meals on Wheels. Well, maybe I can have my employee do some Meals on Wheels phone calls or something like that. So there are a lot of things that you can do, and I'll tell you, talk with your insurance professionals, and they'll give you a whole lot of ideas. By the way, I got my friends, police officers, sitting over here. I belong to the International Chiefs of Police Association. They actually have an authored program on return to work and light duty for police officers. So I believe the website, if you sign up, I think you can publicly get it if you want. So if you're thinking, I'm a police officer, what can our guys do? They have a program that outlines all of those things. We don't have the time to go through that. Trenching and excavation. A lot of municipalities do that themselves, the trench boxes. There was somebody out in eastern Pennsylvania just about a month ago where they had a couple people killed in a collapsed trench. So this stuff happens all the time. If you guys are doing trenching and excavation, they should have some safety programs in place, and they should be trained, because you don't just get injured, you get killed in those accidents. Heavy equipment training. Almost every municipality has either a CDL driver or somebody driving a Bobcat, a dozer, a front-end loader. And a lot of rural municipalities, like I went to IUP, Christmas tree capital of the world, and there's a lot of guys that knew how to drive a tractor before they knew how to drive a car. So I go to the municipality and I say, oh, you have your bunch of equipment here. Well, who's operating it? Where are you getting the training from? Well, he's been driving a tractor since he was a kid. Well, how do we know that they didn't learn all the fundamentals about driving that tractor? What happens when an hydraulic line blows? What should they do? Do they know what they're supposed to do? Do they know how to stop in an emergency procedures? So, pretty important. Pursuit. This one's good for the police. Do you have a foot pursuit and a vehicle pursuit policy? If you don't, you should. Because more accidents happen with the police departments during foot pursuits. Now, I'll pick on these two officers here. They look like they're seasoned citizens. You got a guy that's going to run away from you with a misdemeanor. Are you going to jump a fence after him? These guys ain't running, jumping no fences. Come on, who's he kidding? He's not jumping no fence. He ain't going to chase me jumping the fence. What are you going to do? Get on the radio, call for backup, set a procedure. We want to think smarter, not harder. So if your police departments, if you have them, and they don't have those kind of procedures, they should get those in place. Foot pursuits as well as vehicle pursuits. Most police departments will say you got to talk to a captain or whoever's the most senior officer in charge and get their approval before you pursue. Some have, we're only going to pursue in a felony or class whatever felony. So those are programs that you should have. Contractor controls. Your contractors, if you hire people to come in and do stuff, even like your building, they're on your roof, that's a high hazard job if they're fixing your roof. You gotta make sure they got all these, they have insurance, they're naming you as an additional insured. Because the old days where a handshake was good enough, right? We got our lawyer friend here. The handshake used to be good enough. It's not good enough anymore. Because if they get your contract and then they cancel their insurance, if you're not named as an additional insured on their policy, you'll never know that their insurance was canceled. If you get named, their insurance company is required to notify you as an additional insured. Very, very important. Drug and alcohol testing. Pre-employment, post-accident, random, reasonable suspicion. We don't require it from our insurers, but we highly recommend it. It helps to keep people to have skin in the game, to know that if I get in an accident and I'm trying to go around the system, I'm not going to do that if I know I'm under the influence, if I know I'm going to be randomly checked. Resources. So, LTAP. Everybody know who LTAP is? All of your public works departments will know LTAP. Utilize them. They join the organization. Utilize them. They have excellent resources for training. They'll do training on site. You can go to them. And they have a lot of online stuff as well. PennDOT. They have a lot of training as well. And if you're doing any road work that's shared, PennDOT roads, you're required to do some training, especially like flagger training. And they provide that. So, Pennsylvania Department of Transport. That was wrong. It's not Department of Transportation. It's the PA Bureau of Workers' Compensation, Department of Labor and Industry, DLI. I shouldn't say DOL. That was my typo. Department of Labor and Industry. They have regular online trainings on a variety of subjects, and it's all free. I know you're a municipality and you have unlimited budgets, but this is free. Just go online and search PA Department of Labor and Industry, Bureau of Workers' Compensation. Insurance loss control professionals like myself, you have us at your disposal, and you're lucky in the state of Pennsylvania. If you ask for my help, I got to give it to you. And if I don't have the resources to give it to you, I got to pay somebody else to give it to you. That's one thing that's little known about professional services from loss control people. And independent safety consultants, there are some out there. I will just tell you, consult with your insurance agent if you're going to consider outside consultants, because some of these guys are just in it for the money. And they'll find things wrong just to keep padding their pockets. So talk with your insurance brokers, talk with your insurance company as your first resource, and they might be able to direct you. So that's it.
I have a question. On Heart and Lung, my nightmare, the first time it's ever thrown at me, I've never heard of it. So I got in touch with as many people as I could, and I was shocked to find out how many people who know nothing about it. So I went and I paid him. He would bring the checks in. I would give him his paycheck, so he gave me his workers' comp check. But then at the end of the year, there was issues with taxes that had to be taken and paid in, and I think it was the workers' comp.
Both workers' comp and heart and lung benefits are either one are tax heads.
But at the end of the year, the workers' comp portion was taxable.
It should be.
According to our auditor, yeah, he said I didn't pay enough taxes. So that's where I was a little confused. Why, if I'm writing a check and paying him, and the taxes are already paid in, and then the workers' comp gets deposited in, they're saying I owe taxes on that. And I had to write a check and pay it in.
Now, both workers' comp, now where you could end up with taxes, I'm not sure under their collective bargaining agreement at the end of the year, were they entitled to cash out like vacation days or anything like that? So those benefits aren't workers' comp or heart and lung, so those could be taxable. But that's the only thing I can think of that would be taxable in your situation.
Maybe that's what he was trying to tell me, but he kept telling me.
But the actual payment of the full salary benefit as well as workers' comp, either one are taxable. I assume you're self-insured for both workers' comp and full salary? Yeah, but both of those would be non-taxable to the employee.
Well, that's what I thought, but then my auditor was telling me that where the taxes were coming from was the heart and lung, and I could not wrap my head around it. But yeah, we do get reimbursed when they're sick, they don't leave, and vacation money.
Right, that'd be fringe benefits, that's more employment law under your collective bargaining
That's
agreement, what they're
probably where
entitled to,
the
not to.
additional tax came from. That makes better sense because can you see why I couldn't wrap my head around it? I mean,
Yeah.
I really thought I paid it in. Why did I have to pay it again? And the auditor was not making any sense.
I think if you look at the one, there's actually a case that's on the citations on the slide presentations on there, it says it's not taxable. So there's the case that's right there.
Yeah, I saw that, and that's what I said, and they argued with me. I thank you.
It's very hard to wrap one's head around heart and lung benefits.
Thank you.
That's why I'm so glad that Brad got you to do the presentation.
It was hard to find anyone because I'd never heard of it. And one of my officers came in and said, I need the heart and lung. And I'm like, huh? So here I go. I'm on the internet. I'm calling solicitors, calling auditors, calling insurance. What is this? Because I've never heard of it. It's not in their collective bargaining agreement. It's nowhere in any of our ordinances. It was just right in my lap. And I'm like, okay.
It's like I said, it is at the back, the actual statutes at the back of the
Yeah.
packet there. So like I said, it's not elective.
This was like 2 years into me starting at the borough. You know, it takes 3 years for a secretary to actually know how to do her job. That is seriously the quote. And I was 2 years in and heard something like that, and it was very cruel.
Keep learning.
I think that's why I'm here. I'm like, something's changed, I gotta go.
My question is for Doug. You had mentioned a website to get the return to work duties for a police officer. I missed that. What is that
The
site?
International Association of Chiefs of Police.
Thank you.
And I believe when you go into the website, I believe it allows the general public to go in and access some things, but you have to be a member to access other things. I think that is you're able to.
I think we are a member of that.
And if not, my information is up there. It's my email is doug.hoyle, Hoyle, at amtrustgroup.com. So just send me an email and I'll send you a copy of it.
Thank you.
Hoyle like the playing cards, only without the money.
I have a quick question. For employers who are fully insured, both on the workers' comp side and who purchase the municipal liability insurance, do you find it's an advantage or disadvantage either way to have both with one carrier, with one broker, or pluses and minuses either side of that, for those that actually have insurance for both?
Who are you directing that to?
Part
Okay, so one more time.
So if you have an employer, I mean, is there an advantage or disadvantage to having the same carrier handling both the workers' comp case and the municipal liability case for the Heart and Lung piece? Or is that a disadvantage? Carrier, broker?
I don't typically see different carriers. I mean, if you usually either have a self-insured employer, which has a third-party administrator, and usually they have a third-party administrator handling both the workers' comp and the full salary aspect. The other side is, I know like the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, they have in Servco. But Servco handles essentially the workers' comp component. The departments actually are required to make the payments as opposed to an insurance company. So if you read I think it's the last part of the first Part D, it actually says the specific departments of the Commonwealth are required to make the payments on the full salary amount. Now, that's for the Commonwealth component. The municipalities can be insured, but I would still have the municipality use the same company. Like I said, you don't want one hand not to know what the other hand's doing. So it's ideal the situation is to have one component in place that basically handles that. And like I said, that's why I said you want to coordinate. As the employer, you're liable for the heart and lung benefits, but you don't want to be the one setting up your own independent medical evaluations, and you don't have that expertise, and then to ask the right questions of the doctors. So even though it's something that's the workers' comp insurer is paying just the workers' comp component, not the full salary. You're paying the full salary. You can still have them be the ones that cut the checks for you. I have clients that do that where they enter the payments, but the municipality still cuts the checks. But you want to have that company that you're utilizing as your third-party administrator or your insurer essentially do the other aspects like independent medical evaluations, issuing bureau documents. Like I said, in my case, I have different clients that handle it different ways. The city of Pittsburgh actually created their own form. So now I have a notice of compensation payable issued. That's issued by the third-party administrator. They also issue a bureau document. So they issue both. Now, the County of Allegheny doesn't have formal notices of heart and lung benefits. They just have standard notice of compensation payables or agreement for comp or something. And then they'll have their adjuster, even though it's not something that's technically they're insured for, they're both self-insured, right on the bureau document. Even though the claimant here is injured in performance of their job duties, they're entitled to full salary concurrently with workers' compensation. So just so there's some documentation there that lets the bureau know and everybody else know that whenever you see the payments that are being made, payments may not be the average weekly wage or comp rate. You're going to see a full salary amount. That's another thing I didn't get into in my presentation. Some people want to document and say, okay, the claimant's getting $1,200 a week. $1,025 of that is workers' comp. The additional is full salary. I mean, you can do stuff like that. They usually did that for purposes of trying to delineate what would be subrogable under workers' comp versus not subrogable because of the full salary. But given the recent case law, it doesn't really matter anymore.
The part of your question, April, was municipal liability.
Yeah.
I don't know if there's an advantage, to be honest with you, but we have clients where we have the comp and the municipal liability. That works just fine. And we also have clients where we just have the municipal liability. It's not a problem for us one way or the other. And when we just have the municipal liability, we just rely on the employer to share with us the evidence that they're getting from the work comp carrier with regard to the injured person's disability and what's happening on the work comp side, so that we're aware that the person remains disabled or has come back to work. As long as there's communication from our standpoint, it works just fine.
I was just going to reiterate, because we kind of sit in the middle of that scenario sometimes where workers' comp is with one carrier, municipal liability with another. And the key to that is the communication, and for the comp folks to make sure that they understand, look, we've got to be issuing this check this way, and on the other side of it, from the employer's perspective, that you're saving copies or getting a copy of that pay, the full pay, with the information of what you've paid for, so that you can submit that to the municipal liability carrier. So it's just understanding all of the different players and what you need to provide to each of them to make sure that that goes smoothly.
So is there a packet that like walk you through all the steps if somebody would get hurt, like what forms you need, and would you get that from the person who have your insurance through?
So you have a number of resources. We as an agency do that, and we can provide you with recommendations. Your insurance carrier can provide you with some of that.
And your policy is probably that thick, right? Your workers' comp policy. I would suggest you look through that policy because there are things that the state requires us to put in there. Where's your contact for loss control? Where's your contact for claims? In the event of a claim, do this, do that. That's required to be put in there, and some companies do a better job at that because the state doesn't really specifically say. It says what must be in there, but it doesn't go into a lot of detail. So your insurance carrier can give you that. And I think you raised your hand. You said you were with AmTrust, right? We have a nice little packet. I call it the claims packet. It has all of that stuff in there, step by step, where to go, based on the lines of coverage and all that stuff.
And with AmTrust, you're going to get a separate, the claims kit he's talking about gets mailed to you separately from your policy. And in that is that information that Doug's talking about that would help you with that process.
Do you have any recommendation, and this is probably geared more towards Barb and Doug? We have those packets, we try to get them out to everybody, especially like the volunteer firefighters are obviously the more difficult because we don't have direct oversight over them. But do you have any additional recommendations or whatever of how to get those forms completed on a more timely basis? I mean, that seems to be our challenge. We reiterate annually with our employees about the forms. All the department heads are supposed to be informed.
The rights and duties form?
Yeah. Yeah. So I mean,
Or just the packet as a whole.
Yeah, or the packet as a whole, or just basic information. What happened. The details that we have because the insurance company is calling us. Teeter is. And have you gotten this yet? I mean.
So here's what I would say. I think that just because I'm familiar with your internal process, I would say on the township side, obviously we've put together some policies together at the committee level to introduce to new employees from an orientation standpoint what to do when they're injured, how they should report that, the information about reporting an injury, medical treatment, all of those things are in those policies. So when that gets, the revised policies get rolled out, that will be a more formal process. As far as the rates and duties form goes, you need to make sure that new hires up front, that's in that packet, which I know Vicki has updated that. But what you need to do, and what happens that I know is frustrating for all of you, is changes happen with the panel. Not because you've made a change, but let's say if you're with AmTrust and they start to work with a different vendor for physical therapy. Suddenly the panel changes just because that line item on your panel posting has changed. My recommendation is that the next time that maybe you're sending out forms to all employees for other things, or just like you had a safety fair recently where we just get a new packet out where they sign, check that other box, and then it's taken care of. The volunteers are a challenge for everybody, and Robert may have some advice, or Doug may have some advice, but the volunteers are a little more difficult from the standpoint that just what you're hearing today, some people don't even know what volunteers are covered, to even know who to hand that form out to. And others, it's just not high on their priority list to have people sign off on that form. So it is something that we bring up, like if there's opportunities with the chiefs to talk about, what that proper flow should be, and talk about return to service and all types of policy procedure discussions. But it is a little more challenging because the volunteers aren't always at one place at one time where they can have that happen.
I have some practical advice for this. You can't force someone to sign something they don't want to sign. Okay? Just right out the door, you have to understand that. And we've had people where we present these things to and instruct, and they think if they don't sign it, they don't have to go, okay? And that happens. So from a practical standpoint, I just tell people, if you present it to them and they don't want to sign it, you just write on there as the secretary or whomever, given to Joe so-and-so on this date, refuses not to sign it, and you put it in their personnel file. To me, that's as good as they signed it, okay? Very seldom do, the only time, more often than, I don't want to, everything Barb said is absolutely true, okay? But sometimes things just don't work out in terms of the application of trying to get it done. From my standpoint, if you have a panel, you have a panel, as far as I'm concerned. And if a person, the only time it's going to come into question as to whether that's a formal, legitimate panel is if somebody takes us to task on going to that panel. Other than that, it's our presumption that it's signed, sealed, and delivered, okay? That's just the tack that we take, because you do have a panel, it's probably been posted, and I'm sure some kind of effort's been made. We presume some kind of effort's been made. We don't usually ask for proof of anything unless an injured worker is taking us to task over, I didn't know about it, I didn't do this, I'm not going. Then we have to go find that information to try to combat their resistance on complying with the panel. But I got to tell you, 85, 90% of the time, employees will tell me, we didn't know we had a panel. We fax them a copy of the panel, right there, from the claims desk. Now they know. Here's where you go. And they often just go, because there is a panel. Once they see it, they might even remember, oh yeah. You know, so we try not to get into proving ourselves to anybody. If there's a panel, we believe it's a legitimate panel and we live by it. So it takes care of a lot of the smaller problems that might arise. But make every effort to get it signed. If they won't sign it, you note that you gave it to them, they have it. When they get injured, you remind them of it, give them a copy, and you should be good to go.
One of the things we do too is have a whole packet upon whenever somebody reports an injury that has not just the panel, but has the rights and responsibilities, and actually has basically a form for them to complete themselves saying how the injury occurred. And I think that's really beneficial whenever it does get to litigation. A lot of times you see claims evolve. I have one that I just had a full salary hearing on within the last 3 weeks, where originally EMS was called because of abdominal complaints after a firefighter had something to eat at the firehouse. Next day, the guy comes in, and it was as climbing into the fire truck and hurt my lower, it said right back. So now it's a right back claim. And that's whenever they actually gave him the paperwork in that day and said, okay, here's the whole packet. He hand writes out, here's what happened, which now I have him writing with his own name, saying it's a right low back injury. Now all of a sudden his doctor releases him back to work. We try to get him back to work, have a civil service exam, releases him because of his back, and I just went out and treated a different doctor for my shoulder. Now I got a rotator cuff tear. So whenever you go to litigation, he's trying to explain how he originally went to the panel doctors, and the panel doctors didn't care about his condition. They just started looking at his back and didn't even bother with his shoulder. So, there's several different doctors. So every doctor's in on this and is not really treating him for his injury, even though they have an obligation to treat their patient. It's, their obligations to their patient. Then he treats with an orthopedic doctor, once again, just for the back, not the shoulder. So he's trying to explain it away with, all these doctors just aren't caring. And then you present them with that handwritten report. Well, this is what you filled out. Why did you not mention your shoulder if you injured your shoulder? So it's the best evidence you could use to try to rebut their testimony that there was really a shoulder injury that happened on the day. Whenever they have something in writing that they've signed in terms of their injury report saying it's just a right low back. So, but whenever you give all those forms together, they don't realize necessarily that just telling their supervisor, hey, I was hurt at work, that may be sufficient notice. You say, okay, well here, you gave us notice of an injury, we need you to fill out all this paperwork. If they think they need to fill all that paperwork out to get their claim reported, usually you have a lot more chance of getting the success of having them fill that out and return it, and they want to do it quickly because they want their claim to be either accepted or denied. So you get them the whole packet at once, and hopefully that gets you your information quicker. But once again, you're still relying upon the employer most likely to give them that packet.
And the changes that Barb mentioned with these panels, they're endless. You'll have a provider that move to another area. You'll have a provider who decides they don't want to handle comp anymore. You have a doctor that you think is there, he left, it's another name, they want to change. I mean, it's just ongoing where these panels, they're living documents is what they are. And they keep changing, and you make the best effort you can, to communicate the changes, but you can't drive yourself crazy over it. You distribute it, maybe even you could even distribute it with a paycheck. Hand it to them at the end of the week. Here's the new panel. Well, they have it. Put a copy in the folder. It was given to them. They know about it. You know, we're going to enforce it. Okay, it's that important. Okay, and unless we are confronted significantly to change our opinion about it, or you are confronted significantly to change your opinion about it, then we'll get down into the weeds and figure out, was it signed? When did he find out? But for the most part, if you have a panel, you got a panel. You made an effort, we're going to enforce it.
Well, we have that packet, you know, and we do, to our best ability, have that readily available to everybody, but the challenge is getting them to tell us what did happen and all that stuff, you know, on a timely basis. And when you're talking about 7 to 14 days, you know, to determine, or that window, you know, in which you go back and stuff, it does present a challenge.
So I think that discussion, and you saw it on a number of different slides about a number of different subjects, but it truly just comes back to supervisor manager accountability in that process. Now I know with you all, you have struggled a little bit when it's the volunteer firefighters, but for your regular employees, I think the process has actually evolved over the last 4 or 5 years, and that happens the way it should be. But I think that happened when those department heads were engaged into the process and held accountable to get that information through to your office. Mm-hmm. And that's where you see a change. It's whenever the process isn't communicated well or isn't mapped out well, and so no one's really in charge. Yeah, I'm hurt, so I go to my boss and I say, you know, I've got to go over to Up Health because I just hurt my back. And then it just kind of falls off from there because there's not really any process in place that person needs to hand these forms to the person and they go back to that person. So you just need to make sure that in the makeup of your program, there's accountability to make that happen. Because those packets, just like everybody has talked about, contained in that, and for us, that's where we help take the carrier information and put it in an organized fashion. We even add to that, we work with the carriers to put their medical authorization in there, so that they're more likely to just sign all that stuff when they sit down to do the packet. So we're handing over to the adjusters signed medical auth, an employee statement, you know, everything's ready and kind of handed to the adjuster with a bow on it that, you know, a day or two after the injury has happened. I know it's not a priority for people, but you really, when somebody's injured, need to have some level of accountability. What?
It is when they get the bill.
It is, so they'll get that bill to you really quick.
Then I get paid.
Yeah, yeah.
And you're not alone. I said that before. I mean, if you're in a situation where you have a carrier, I would not delay the reporting of the injury because you're sitting there thinking, I got to do this, I got to do this, I got to do that. Don't let that delay reporting of the injury. I mean, the Work Comp Act says you're supposed to report something immediately when it's reported to you. Now, we could all interpret what immediately means, but you're going to find out some rudimentary information, but get it out, report it, and then you're going to have people working with you and helping you to get whatever we need to make it happen.
The longer you delay the reporting of the accident, the higher the cost goes for that claim exponentially. So try to get it, keep it in your mind, beat it into your supervisors' heads. I mean, they gotta know, this is your responsibility of being a manager, as being a lead, as being a supervisor. This is your job to do. You gotta get this information and you gotta get it to us quickly. Even if it's just, an email, a text, get us something so that we know, so that we can get our claims folks on the hook to contact that employee. Because if the employee's not contacted within a couple of days, they get people in their heads. And they watch those commercials. And next thing you know, they want to go to a lawyer. Have you been injured in a workplace accident? Call Edgar Schneider. Everybody's seen that commercial, right? So, and people get in their heads. So if they get, you guys contact them within a couple days, right?
Yeah, 24 hours.
24 hours. We have a 24-hour policy. So at least they're getting somebody to call them, hey, I heard you were, injured in an accident, or you had this happen to you. So they're getting at least direct contact.
But I'll just ask one question. What can we do to help push that minimum limits increase?
Well, it's in the insurance committee, which is really, I think, where it should have been. For some reason, it was referred initially to transportation. And I don't know if there were political considerations behind that or not, but although it deals with motor vehicles, so it certainly impacts transportation, it's really the heart of the bill is an increase in the insurance limit. I will tell you this, that both the Insurance Federation and the trial lawyers have both told me personally that bill is their #1 priority. The trial lawyers getting it through, the Insurance Federation not letting it go through. So my guess is that it's going to sit in the committee for a while. I don't know if it's going to move on. It's really up to the chairman of the insurance committee whether it moves or not. I tell people all the time when they come to me and they ask me to sponsor legislation, I'm happy to do that. But as a freshman, I always say to them, it would probably be better if you get somebody that's a little more senior to do it, because what happens is if you see a freshman sponsor something, a lot of times the other members of the House think they couldn't get anybody else to do it. They got a freshman to do it. So I tell them, try to get somebody more senior. If it's a bill that, for instance, is going to go to the insurance committee, see if you can get somebody in the insurance committee to sponsor it. Or even better, get the chair of the insurance committee, if you can, to sponsor the bill, because they're very good at bringing their own bills up in committee for consideration. So your guess is as good as mine. Whatever the particular time frame is for the bill moving forward, 90% plus of bills that die in committee. They're just never brought forward. And so very, very few bills that actually come out of committee are voted down. But almost all of them die in committee. Where this one will go, I don't know. Aaron Coffer sits right behind me. He's a great guy. It's a great bill. But the Insurance Federation is putting up a real fight. And that may be one of the reasons why it hasn't been reported out.